Before anyone knew his name, a soaked stranger walked into the restaurant looking like he might not survive another minute.
Do not let him near the tables.
Then his strength faded in the middle of lunch, and the room treated his need like something shameful to avoid. Only Naomi moved toward him, not because she was fearless, but because everyone else had chosen distance.
Somebody call emergency services now.
Naomi saw a human being where everyone else saw trouble, dirt, danger, or an interruption to their lunch.
Please, I'm sorry.
Kendra Blythe did not ask whether the man was breathing. She only saw him as a stain on her restaurant.
Stand up before you make this place look filthy.
Naomi had almost nothing left, but she spent her last money, so the stranger would not reach the hospital hungry.
Compassion is not in your job description. Take off the apron. You are done here. Use the back door. Even let her leave through the front door.
She sent Naomi into the rain like shame belonged to her. The customers who had watched Naomi kneel beside a dying man now watched her lose her job for it. Some looked away. Some looked embarrassed. Some looked relieved that the punishment had not landed on them. Only one person tried to follow her. A busboy named Isaiah, barely 19, took 2 steps forward before Kendra's stare pinned him back in place. He had 2 younger sisters and a mother on disability. Fear did what cruelty always depends on it to do. Naomi left with her apron folded in her hands, her final tip still trapped in Kendra's locked drawer, and rain soaking through her shoes by the time she reached the bus stop. That night, she told her Aunt Lottie only part of the truth. Lottie Reed was 68, though illness had aged her unevenly. Some mornings, she remembered entire hymns from childhood and the smell of Naomi's mother's perfume. Other mornings, she forgot the word for window. A stroke 3 years earlier had weakened her left side, and a slow fog had settled over her memory after that, arriving in patches that came and went without warning. Naomi had moved into the little apartment on Anson Street to care for her after Naomi's mother died of heart failure, because there had been no one else willing and no money for proper help. Naomi had once been on a different path. At 18, she had graduated near the top of her class, with a scholarship letter from a nursing program folded in a Bible on her mother's dresser. Teachers had called her steady. Counselors had called her promising. Her mother had called her the one who would break the cycle. But cycles do not break just because a letter says congratulations. Sometimes they tighten. Sometimes a hospital bill arrives. Sometimes a caregiver is needed more urgently than a dreamer. So Naomi traded lecture halls for double shifts, textbooks for order pads, and a future with clean white shoes for work shoes that pinched until her toes went numb. She did not regret caring for Lottie. Love was not the problem. The problem was that love did not pay rent, did not refill prescriptions, did not stop landlords from taping notices to doors. The problem was that people praised sacrifice from a distance, then punished the person making it for being tired. By dawn, after the longest night of her life, Naomi had calculated everything and found no answer. Without the diner, she had no paycheck. Without the paycheck, she had no rent. Without rent, Lottie could lose the only home she recognized. Naomi had prayed, but even prayer felt like it had to squeeze through a ceiling crowded with other desperate voices. Then the envelope came. It did not arrive in the mail. It did not come with a knock. It slid silently under the door just before sunrise, a pale blue rectangle against the scratched wooden floor. Naomi stared at it for several seconds before standing. Her first thought was that it might be another notice from the landlord. Her second was that she no longer had room in her chest for one more bad thing. The envelope had her name written across the front in dark ink, not printed. Written. Naomi Reed. The letters were careful, almost old-fashioned. There was no return address, only a small embossed mark in the corner. A lantern surrounded by 3 waves. Inside was not money. That almost disappointed her before she could stop herself. Inside was a single card, thick and expensive, with an address on East Bay Street and a request for her presence that morning at 9. Beneath the address was a line that made Naomi sit down before her knees could make the decision for her. It said that her act at the Mariners' table had not gone unseen. That was all. No explanation. No signature she recognized. Just that sentence, sitting in her lap like a match struck in a dark room. Naomi almost threw it away. People in trouble learn caution. Miracles, when they appear too suddenly, often come with hidden hooks. But the address belonged to the old Peabody House, a restored building near the harbor that Naomi knew only from passing it on the bus. It had once been a shipping office. Now, according to the brass plaque she had seen from the sidewalk, it belonged to something called the Lantern Harbor Foundation. She searched the name on her cracked phone. The screen loaded slowly, then showed a website full of polished photographs, food programs, mobile clinics, emergency shelters, legal aid, hurricane relief. The foundation had been started decades earlier by a shipping family that had turned old warehouse money into charity. Its current chair was a woman named Celeste Vane, known in Charleston for giving away money with one hand and guarding her privacy with the other. Naomi did not understand what any of it had to do with her. Still, at 8:30, after making sure Lottie had breakfast and leaving the neighbor with a number to call in case of trouble, Naomi put on her cleanest blouse, brushed lint from her coat, and took the bus toward East Bay Street. She carried the blue envelope in her bag like evidence in a trial no one had explained. The Peabody House looked even larger up close. Its windows were tall and arched, its brick washed clean by rain, its front steps flanked by planters full of white flowers that looked too expensive to touch. Naomi paused at the bottom step, suddenly aware of her shoes, her tired eyes, and the faint smell of diner grease still caught in her hair, no matter how carefully she had washed it. A security guard opened the door before she reached it. He did not ask whether she belonged. He said her name with respect and guided her inside. That unsettled her, more than suspicion would have. The lobby was warm and quiet. Not rich in the loud way of chandeliers and marble meant to impress, but in the deep, quiet way of places built by people who expect the world to move aside. Oil paintings lined the walls. A long table held brochures about flood relief and food access. Near the back, through a set of open doors, Naomi saw a conference room where 3 people stood waiting. One was Celeste Vane. She was in her 70s, silver-haired, straight-backed, and smaller than Naomi expected. Her face held the calm of someone who had survived more than her portrait suggested. Beside her stood a lawyer with a leather folder, and near the window, wrapped in a clean sweater, thinner but alive, was the man from the diner. Naomi stopped breathing for a moment. The man looked different without rainwater dripping from his coat. His beard had been trimmed. His skin still carried the grayness of recovery, but his eyes were clear. He was not polished. He was not suddenly transformed into someone untouched by pain, but he was alive. And when he saw Naomi, the shame in his expression changed into something more fragile and more difficult to bear: gratitude. Celeste Vane did not begin with grand speeches. She explained gently that the man Naomi had helped was named Adrian Vane, her only son. He had not been missing in the way newspapers like to describe missing heirs. His story was messier, more human, and far less convenient for gossip. Years earlier, after the death of his wife and little daughter in a highway accident, Adrian had withdrawn from the world he once helped serve. Grief had taken the shape of silence, then isolation, then a long wandering that no family money could easily fix. He had refused interviews, refused board meetings, refused even the name that tied him to wealth. For months, he had been living between shelters, ferry terminals, and hospital waiting rooms, convinced that the comfort of his family was something he no longer deserved. The Foundation had searched for him quietly. Too much publicity could have turned his suffering into entertainment. Too much pressure could have driven him farther away. On the day Naomi found him, Adrian had been trying to reach the Foundation office on foot after losing his medication and his wallet during a storm. He had made it only as far as the mariner's table. Every person in that restaurant had seen a problem. Naomi had seen a person. Celeste made sure Naomi understood that this difference had likely saved Adrian's life. The emergency physician had said another hour in the cold rain, with his blood sugar collapsing and his body weakened, might have ended very differently. The meal Naomi paid for had arrived with the paramedics' paperwork and had become the detail that made everyone at the hospital talk, not because of its cost, but because of what it cost Naomi. Naomi felt heat rise behind her eyes. She tried to say that anyone would have done the same, but even as the thought formed, she knew it was not true. Everyone had been there. Everyone had seen him. Most had chosen distance. Celeste then did something Naomi did not expect. She did not offer a reward in the crude way people sometimes pay for conscience, as if kindness were a lost wallet returned for a fee. Instead, she asked Naomi about her life, not with pity, not with the polished curiosity of donors touring poverty for an afternoon. She asked as if Naomi's answers mattered. Naomi did not tell everything at first. Pride has its own survival instinct. But Celeste had spent decades listening to people who were tired of needing help, and she knew how to wait. Slowly, Naomi told her about Lottie, the unpaid rent, the nursing scholarship that had expired, the diner job, and the way Kendra had dismissed her in front of a room full of witnesses. She left out the most humiliating details until Adrian, from beside the window, lowered his head as though each one had landed on him personally. By the end of the meeting, Naomi's life had changed in ways she could not immediately absorb. The Lantern Harbor Foundation offered her a position coordinating a new community meals program called Harbor Hands, which would partner with local restaurants to create emergency meal vouchers for people in crisis. The salary was more than double what she had made at the diner. The benefits included home care support that could help with Lottie's medical needs. The foundation's housing attorney would contact Naomi's landlord that afternoon to stop the eviction and settle the arrears from a hardship fund, not as charity tossed from above, but as stabilization for a caregiver who had been carrying too much alone. Naomi listened with her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles ached. She had expected, at most, a thank you note, perhaps a small check, perhaps nothing she could rely on. She had not expected an opening. She had not expected someone to look at her years of sacrifice and see qualifications instead of weakness. Celeste explained that the foundation did not need someone who merely understood policy. It needed someone who understood hunger without making hungry people feel small. It needed someone who knew the difference between feeding a person and humiliating them. It needed someone who had proven, under pressure, that human dignity mattered even when it was inconvenient. Naomi accepted. But stories like Naomi's do not end the moment good news arrives. In real life, blessings often disturb the people who benefited from your struggle. And Kendra Blythe had built too much of her little kingdom on Naomi, staying silent, poor, and disposable to accept Naomi's rise quietly. At first, Kendra only heard rumors. A delivery driver mentioned that the waitress she had fired had been seen entering the Peabody house. A former customer called the restaurant, asking whether it was true that the woman who helped the collapsed man now worked for the Lantern Harbor Foundation. Isaiah, trying and failing to hide his smile, told another server that Naomi's rent had been handled and her aunt would get medical support. By closing time, Kendra was no longer angry. She was afraid. Fear is different in people who are used to having power. It does not make them humble. It makes them dangerous. Kendra knew things the staff did not. She knew that for nearly 2 years, she had been skimming from the cash drawer in small amounts that looked like counting errors. She knew she had been marking donated community meals as served, then pocketing the reimbursement money when the owner was away. She knew she had refused hungry people at the door while reporting that the restaurant had participated in local relief efforts. She knew the jar labeled "Storm Meal Fund" had been emptied by her hand more than once. Its coins and bills treated as a private bonus for the trouble of pretending to care. She also knew Naomi had noticed irregularities. Naomi had never accused her. Naomi had been too busy surviving, but she had asked questions. She had once wondered why a church group's prepaid meal vouchers were missing from the drawer. She had once found a voided receipt under the printer with Kendra's manager code on it. She had once given a free bowl of gumbo to a veteran after Kendra claimed the voucher program had ended, only for Naomi to discover the next week that the program was still active. At the time, Kendra had dismissed the questions as confusion. Now she saw them as threats. By the next morning, Kendra had created a new story. According to her, Naomi had not been fired for helping a stranger. Naomi had been fired after an internal review suggested she had stolen money from the register and used a medical emergency to distract from it. Kendra did not make the accusation loudly at first. She was too strategic. She let it leak in pieces, through staff whispers, through a carefully worded email to the restaurant owner, through a complaint sent to the Lantern Harbor Foundation's general inbox. The complaint claimed that Naomi Reed was dishonest, unstable, and unfit to handle charitable funds. To make the lie look official, Kendra pressured Isaiah to sign a witness note stating that he had seen Naomi near the drawer before cash went missing. Isaiah refused at first. He said he had seen nothing like that. But Kendra knew his schedule, his family situation, and his fear of losing the only job close enough to home. She cut his hours in half for 1 week, then returned them with a warning hidden behind a smile. By the second week, Isaiah signed a statement he hated himself for signing. Kendra also convinced a prep cook named Marisol to say Naomi had been upset about money. That part was technically true, which made the lie harder to fight. Naomi had been upset about money because poverty had been pressing its knee against her chest for years. Kendra twisted that human truth into motive. When the foundation received the complaint, they did what responsible organizations must do. They placed Naomi on temporary administrative leave while the matter was reviewed. Celeste herself called Naomi and made it clear that leave was not judgment, but process. Still, the word leave felt like a door closing. Naomi had held her new job for only 11 days. The apartment that had begun to feel safe became heavy again. Lottie sensed Naomi's sadness even through the fog of her memory. Some evenings, she reached for Naomi's hand without knowing exactly why. Naomi tried not to cry in front of her. She had cried enough into dishwater, enough into bus windows, enough silently behind the walk-in freezer at the diner. She was tired of tears that changed nothing. What hurt most was not even the risk of losing the job. It was the precision of the lie. Kendra had chosen the accusation that would wound Naomi deepest because Naomi had spent her whole life guarding her integrity. Poor people learned that one mistake can become their whole identity. In the mouths of people looking for reasons to dismiss them, Naomi had always kept receipts, counted change twice, returned overpayments, corrected tips when customers wrote too much by accident. She knew how quickly a black woman in a service uniform could be called dishonest by someone whose own theft wore perfume and a manager badge. For 3 days, Naomi heard nothing. During those 3 days, Kendra enjoyed herself. She moved through the mariner's table with renewed sharpness, telling staff that consequences were finally catching up with people who played saint for attention. She pretended not to care when customers asked about Naomi, then made sure they received a version of events muddy enough to stain her. She even printed a new policy about employee conduct during emergencies, as if compassion had been a workplace hazard. But lies require maintenance. Truth can sit quietly and wait. The first crack came from Isaiah. Guilt can make a room feel too small. Isaiah stopped sleeping. He replayed the moment Naomi knelt beside Adrian, the way she had held his hand without flinching, the way everyone else, including him, had stood back. He replayed the moment Kendra pushed the witness note toward him and reminded him how many people wanted his job. He thought about his sisters, yes, but he also thought about what kind of man he was becoming if fear could make him harm the one person who had always treated him like he mattered. On the 4th morning, Isaiah went to the foundation office before his shift. He arrived shaking harder than Adrian had shaken in the diner, carrying a folded copy of the statement he had signed. He told the foundation's review attorney that it was false. He admitted Kendra had pressured him. He admitted he had never seen Naomi steal anything. He admitted something else, too. For months, he had watched Kendra remove cash from the store meal fund jar and replace donation vouchers with blank slips. That confession did not clear Naomi immediately, but it shifted the room. The second crack came from Marisol. She had been quiet for years because she needed work, and because Kendra had a way of making every immigrant employee feel one document away from disaster, whether that was true or not. Marisol had signed nothing, but she had allowed Kendra to use her name in the complaint. When she learned Isaiah had gone to the foundation, she did not want him standing alone. She brought what Kendra had forgotten existed: photographs. Months earlier, Marisol had photographed several prep lists and reimbursement sheets because Kendra kept blaming kitchen staff for missing voucher meals. At the time, Marisol had only wanted proof that the kitchen had prepared what it was told to prepare. But the photos showed a pattern. On days when the restaurant claimed to have served 20 donated meals, the kitchen had prepared 6. On days when reimbursement forms showed full distribution, staff meal logs showed no matching plates. Several forms had Kendra's manager code. Some had Naomi's initials forged badly enough that anyone who knew her handwriting could see the insult. The third crack came from Adrian. Recovery had not made him suddenly powerful in the way people imagine wealth fixes everything. He was still grieving. He still moved carefully through rooms. He still carried guilt like a second spine. But he had one thing Kendra had not counted on: memory sharpened by humiliation. Adrian remembered the man in the navy suit recording him when he fell. He remembered the angle of the phone. He remembered the table. He remembered the woman at the register who had complained about the interruption while filming half the room. The Foundation's attorney tracked the video after a younger staff member found a clipped version online, posted without context, under a caption mocking the stranger on the floor. The internet, for all its cruelty, sometimes preserves what liars hope will disappear. The clipped version showed Naomi kneeling. It showed customers backing away. It showed Kendra standing with folded arms. But it did not show the register clearly. The Foundation needed more. The restaurant's internal cameras, according to Kendra, had malfunctioned that day. The owner, Mr. Harlan Cho, was told the system had overwritten the footage. That should have ended the matter. It did not. Mr. Cho had inherited the mariner's table from his father, who had opened it after serving as a Navy cook. Harlan was not a cruel man, but he was an absent one. And absence in leadership often becomes permission for someone worse to take over. He had trusted Kendra because she kept the restaurant profitable and problems quiet. He had ignored small complaints because he was tired, overextended, and grieving his own divorce. When the Lantern Harbor Foundation contacted him directly, he expected a misunderstanding. Instead, he discovered that his security system had not failed. Kendra had disabled the local storage, but she had forgotten about the backup connected to the insurance provider after a break-in the previous year. The footage wasn't on the restaurant computer. It was in a secure archive she did not know how to erase. Harlan watched it alone first. He watched Naomi serving tables during the rush. He watched Adrian enter, soaked and unsteady. He watched the room recoil. He watched Naomi kneel while Kendra stood back. He watched Naomi ask for emergency help. He watched her pay at the register with her own debit card, not remove money from it. He watched Kendra take Naomi's apron and send her out the side door. Then Harlan kept watching. The archive held more than that day. It held weeks. It held Kendra opening the donation jar after closing. It held her removing envelopes from the voucher drawer. It held her entering manager codes during cash outs, voiding meals that had been paid for by community partners, and slipping bills into the side pocket of her blazer. It held her handing Isaiah the witness note in the storage hallway, pointing toward the schedule board, and making the threat clear even without audio. The truth had not needed to shout. It had needed someone to look. When Naomi was called back to the Foundation office, she expected another question, another form, another polite expression from people deciding whether to believe her. Instead, she found Celeste, Adrian, Harlan Cho, Isaiah, Marisol, and the Foundation attorney seated around the same conference table where hope had first begun to feel possible. Naomi stood at the doorway, uncertain whether she had entered a trial or a rescue. Celeste did not make her wait. She explained that the accusations had been withdrawn, disproven, and referred for further action. Harlan apologized, with a face so pale, it seemed the shame had drained him. He admitted that his trust in Kendra had allowed harm to grow under his roof. Isaiah cried before he could finish his apology. Marisol kept her eyes lowered until Naomi crossed the room and touched her shoulder. Not because Naomi owed anyone comfort, but because she understood what fear could do to good people trapped under bad authority. Adrian said the least, but his presence said enough. He had been the man on the floor. Now he was one of the reasons the truth was standing. Naomi was cleared fully. Her leave was ended. Her name was restored. But restoration, for someone who has been publicly humiliated, is not simply a letter saying the matter is closed. A lie travels through people. It enters rooms before you do. It sits in the air, waiting to see whether you will defend yourself or shrink. Celeste understood that. So did Harlan. The Mariners' table held a staff meeting the following Monday before opening. This time, Naomi did not enter through the side door. She entered through the front. The same bell rang above her head, bright and careless, just as it had the day Adrian collapsed. But the room felt different now. The chairs were stacked on tables. The floor smelled of lemon cleaner. The staff stood near the counter, tense and quiet. Kendra was there too, though no longer behind the host stand. Her makeup was perfect, but her face had lost the confidence that once made people step aside. Harlan spoke first, not with the polished language of corporate apologies, but with the rough honesty of a man who had finally looked at what his neglect had cost. He told the staff that Naomi Reed had been wrongfully fired, falsely accused, and publicly mistreated for doing what every decent person in that room should have done. He confirmed that Kendra Blythe had been terminated for cause, and that evidence of theft, intimidation, falsification of records, and charity fraud had been turned over to the proper authorities. Kendra tried to hold herself stiff, as if posture could substitute for innocence. But there are moments when a person's own silence becomes a confession. She had spent years making others feel small under fluorescent lights. Now she stood under the same lights, while the room learned what she had done. The poetic justice was not loud, it was precise. Kendra had fired Naomi for feeding a hungry stranger, and now the theft that destroyed her reputation came from money meant to feed hungry strangers. She had accused Naomi of stealing from a register, and the register logs exposed her. She had used employees' fear to create false statements, and those same employees became the witnesses who helped undo her. She had sent Naomi through the side door in shame, and Naomi returned through the front, while Kendra left, escorted by the owner she had deceived. No one applauded. It was better that way. Applause might have made it feel like a performance. This was not a performance. It was accountability. Kendra's downfall did not end at the sidewalk. Investigators later found that the stolen voucher funds were larger than anyone first believed. Several small churches had paid the Mariners' table in advance to provide hot meals during storms, believing their donations had reached people who needed them. Some had not. A veterans group had sponsored meal cards that were quietly canceled in the system. A neighborhood relief fund had been billed for plates never served. Kendra had not merely stolen cash. She had stolen trust from people who gave what little they had to help others. The charges that followed did not make Naomi happy. She was not the kind of person who found joy in someone else's ruin. But she did feel something steadier than happiness. She felt the weight of a foot lifting from her neck. She felt the world, for once, refusing to ask the wounded person to be the only one who pays. Kendra tried to find another management job, but Charleston is smaller than pride imagines. People talk, records travel, references matter. The same polished confidence that once opened doors now raised questions she could not answer. For the first time in years, Kendra had to live without the protection of a title, and without people beneath her to blame. Naomi returned to the Lantern Harbor Foundation the next day, not as a woman rescued by luck, but as someone beginning the work she had been preparing for her whole life without knowing it. Harbor Hand started small. At first, It was only a list of 5 restaurants willing to keep emergency meal cards behind the counter. The cards were simple, with no public label that could embarrass the person using them. A church, a shelter nurse, a bus driver, or a school counselor could request one. The meal would be served without questions, without a speech, without making hunger prove itself worthy. Naomi insisted on that. Hunger had already humiliated people enough. She built the program from memory as much as training. She remembered the mother counting coins under the table. She remembered the veteran turned away over a missing voucher. She remembered Adrian's hand trembling on a cold tile floor while strangers measured whether he deserved to be touched. She remembered all the people she had served at the Mariners' table who were one bad week away from becoming invisible. Her first major policy was called the warm seat rule. Any participating restaurant that accepted foundation funds had to agree that a person in crisis could sit inside safely while waiting for help, even if they could not order immediately. No one would be forced back into rain because discomfort was bad for business. No one would be treated like a threat for needing warmth. Some restaurant owners resisted. They worried about image, customer complaints, and liability. Naomi listened. Then she told them, calmly and without accusation, that a business afraid of being seen helping hungry people was not actually afraid of liability. It was afraid of being reminded what community means. A surprising number signed after that. The Mariners' table became one of the first official partners. Harlan Cho did more than sign. He changed the restaurant. He installed transparent accounting for every donated meal. He created a staff emergency fund. He hired an outside manager with nonprofit experience. He raised wages modestly but meaningfully, because guilt without structural change is only emotion wearing a better suit. He also placed a small brass plaque near the entrance, not with Naomi's face or a dramatic version of the story, but with a simple line that said every person who entered hungry deserved to leave treated as human. Naomi did not ask for the plaque. At first, she did not even like it. She worried it made her one act of kindness seem exceptional when she believed it should have been ordinary. But Celeste told her that reminders were necessary because decency often disappears not from one grand act of evil, but from 100 small permissions to look away. Adrian slowly returned to himself, though not to the man he had been before tragedy. Some losses do not give back the original version of a person. They make something quieter, deeper, sometimes more compassionate, sometimes more fragile. He began volunteering with Harbor Hands, first behind the scenes, reviewing supply lists and helping design intake forms that did not shame people. Later, he trained with peer support counselors to work with people in grief, addiction recovery, and housing instability. He did not pretend his family name had saved him. In fact, he understood more clearly than anyone that it almost had not. Money had searched for him, but a waitress with $38 had reached him first. That truth changed him. His relationship with Celeste healed slowly. Mother and son had spent years separated by grief, guilt, and all the words each feared would injure the other. Naomi never intruded on that healing. She only noticed, over months, that Adrian stopped standing near exits during meetings. Celeste stopped looking at him as if he might vanish if she blinked. One afternoon, Naomi saw them walk together along the harbor after a fundraiser, not speaking much, simply sharing space. Sometimes that is what forgiveness looks like before it has language. At home, life changed too. The foundation helped Naomi and Lottie move from the drafty apartment on Anson Street into a small but bright unit near a park. with an elevator, reliable heat, and a window where Lottie could watch children chasing pigeons in the afternoon. The first night there, Lottie became agitated because the walls did not feel familiar. Naomi sat with her until the fear passed, describing each room softly, grounding her in the names of things. The next morning, Lottie woke and said the sunlight looked kind. Naomi cried in the kitchen where no one could see. For years, she had measured success in avoided disasters. Rent not late enough to evict, medicine not empty enough to panic, electricity not shut off yet, shoes not broken beyond repair. Now she had space to imagine a life not built entirely around emergencies. She enrolled in evening courses toward a community health certification, not because she needed a title to prove her worth, but because the dream she had buried at 18 still had roots. The scholarship letter from long ago remained in her Bible, creased and yellowing. She did not look at it with grief anymore. She looked at it like evidence that the girl she had been was still somewhere inside the woman she had become, not lost, only waiting. Months passed, and Harbor Hands grew. What began with 5 restaurants became 15, then 28. A mobile meal van joined the program after hurricane season, exposed neighborhoods where older residents could not reach distribution sites. School counselors started calling when students came to class, hungry after weekends. Hospital social workers requested meal cards for discharged patients who had nowhere stable to go. Bus drivers carried small information cards because they were often the first to see who was sleeping where the city pretended not to look. Naomi worked harder than she ever had at the diner, but the work no longer shrank her. There is a difference between exhaustion that empties you and exhaustion that has meaning. She still had difficult days. She still dealt with budgets, skeptical donors, broken supply chains, and people who assumed compassion could be scheduled neatly between office hours. But she also saw men who had been ignored sit down to hot stew without being watched like criminals. She saw mothers receive grocery boxes before shame could force them to choose between pride and dinner. She saw restaurant workers begin to understand that dignity was not extra service, it was the meal. The story of Naomi's firing eventually reached local news, though Celeste did everything possible to keep it from turning into spectacle. Reporters wanted a clean headline: "Poor waitress saves rich heir. Villain manager exposed. Charity triumphs." But life is rarely that clean. Naomi agreed to one interview only after insisting that the focus remain on food insecurity and worker vulnerability, not on turning her into a saint. She was not a saint. She was a woman who had been tired, broke, and scared, and had still chosen to kneel. That distinction mattered. Saints are easy to admire because people imagine they are different from the rest of us. A tired woman choosing mercy with overdue bills in her pocket is much harder to ignore because she removes the excuse that kindness belongs only to people with spare time, spare money, or spotless lives. The interview aired on a Sunday evening. Naomi watched it with Lottie, who understood pieces of it. At one point, Lottie touched the screen when Naomi appeared, then looked at the real Naomi sitting beside her and smiled with sudden recognition. For one clear moment, the fog lifted enough for pride to pass through. Lottie remembered Naomi's mother then. She remembered the hospital. She remembered the little girl who used to line up dolls and pretend to check their temperatures. She remembered enough to tell Naomi, in her own wandering way, that her mother would have been proud. Naomi held that sentence for days, But the most important moment in Naomi's new life did not happen on television. It happened almost 1 year after the firing, on another rainy Tuesday afternoon, at the reopened Mariner's Table. The restaurant was hosting the launch of an expanded Harbor Hands partnership. There were donors, city officials, restaurant workers, shelter coordinators, and a few regular customers who remembered the old days with uncomfortable clarity. The event could have become polished and empty, the kind of gathering where people discuss hunger over catered trays. Naomi refused to let that happen. Instead of speeches first, she asked everyone to sit for a meal served family style. No VIP table, no reserved corner for donors, no separation between people with checks and people with lived experience. Adrian helped serve. Harlan cleared plates. Celeste sat beside a former shelter resident who now worked as a peer navigator. The room, once divided by fear and judgment, felt almost unfamiliar in its warmth. Near the end, Naomi stood where Kendra had once fired her. She did not describe Kendra with hatred. She did not need to. Hatred would have made Kendra too central to a story that had grown beyond her. Naomi spoke instead about the floor, the actual floor of the restaurant, the tile near table 6 where Adrian had collapsed. She said that every community has a floor like that, a place where someone falls and everyone else must decide what kind of person they are. Some step back, some record, some complain about the inconvenience, and sometimes one person kneels, not because they are fearless, but because they know what it feels like to need someone. She explained that Harbor Hands existed to make kneeling less lonely. It existed so mercy would not depend on one waitress risking her job or one stranger being connected to a powerful family. It existed because people should not have to be secretly important to be treated as worth saving. That line stayed with everyone. People should not have to be secretly important to be treated as worth saving. Adrian lowered his eyes when she said it. Celeste reached for his hand. Harlan looked toward the doorway, perhaps remembering all the people his restaurant had once allowed to be turned away. Isaiah, now promoted and studying hospitality management with foundation support, wiped his face quickly and pretended he had not. Marisol smiled openly, no longer afraid of being seen. After the event, when the room had emptied and rain softened the windows, Naomi stood for a moment by table 6. The tile had been repaired, where a crack once ran through it. Most people would never know anything had happened there. That seemed right to her. Sacred places do not always announce themselves. Sometimes they hide under ordinary tables in ordinary diners, waiting for ordinary people to make choices that echo farther than they can see. Naomi thought about the blue envelope that had slid under her door before dawn. For a long time, she had believed that envelope was the beginning of her rescue. Now she understood it differently. The rescue had begun earlier, on the floor, when she refused to let the room decide a man's value for her. The envelope had only carried the news that kindness, though delayed, had found its way back. And yet, she also knew kindness did not always return with a foundation job, a new apartment, or public vindication. Sometimes kindness returns quietly. Sometimes it returns years later, through a child who remembers being fed. Sometimes it returns only as the knowledge that you did not become cruel when cruelty would have been easier. That kind of return is harder to measure, but it is real. Naomi kept the blue envelope. She framed it in her office, not because of the address or the embossed lantern, but because of the sentence inside. Her act had not gone unseen. On difficult days, when funding was short or the need felt endless, she looked at that sentence and thought of all the unseen acts happening across the city. A cashier slipping a sandwich into a bag, a bus driver waiting an extra minute for an elderly passenger, a teacher sending food home without making a child explain, a nurse warming a blanket for someone no family had come to visit, a neighbor knocking on a door before the silence became permanent. The world is held together by people who do small mercies without witnesses. But Naomi also learned that mercy must become more than a moment. It must become policy. It must become systems. It must become wages, shelters, meal programs, honest records, and leaders who do not leave vulnerable workers at the mercy of petty tyrants. One good person can save a life. A good community can stop that life from falling so far in the first place. Years later, when people asked Naomi why she helped Adrian that day, they expected a dramatic answer. They expected her to say she sensed he was important, or that fate whispered to her, or that she had some grand vision of what would follow. She always disappointed them gently. She explained that she had no idea who he was. She did not see a foundation heir, a lost son, or a future partner in a citywide program. She saw a man on the floor. That was enough. And maybe that is the part of the story worth carrying with us. Not the envelope, not the money, not the downfall of a cruel manager, satisfying as justice may be. The heart of the story is the moment before reward exists, before witnesses understand, before the world claps, before anyone promises that goodness will be repaid. It is the moment when helping costs something. Naomi lost her job in that moment. She spent the last of her money in that moment. She was humiliated in that moment, but she kept something Kendra could never steal, even with false statements and forged records. She kept the kind of dignity that does not depend on a title. She kept the kind of courage that survives poverty, grief, and exhaustion. She kept the part of herself that still believed a stranger's life was worth bending down for. Kendra, in the end, lost everything she had tried to protect by refusing to bend. She protected the restaurant's image and destroyed her own. She guarded the cash drawer and exposed her theft. She treated compassion as weakness and discovered too late that compassion had witnesses stronger than fear. That is how justice sometimes works. Not always quickly, not always loudly, but with a patience that follows every hidden thing to its door. So the next time you see someone fall, maybe not on a restaurant floor, maybe not in a way anyone else can see, remember Naomi Reed. Remember the room that stepped back. Remember the woman who knelt. Remember that a person does not become worthy of kindness because they are secretly rich, secretly connected, or secretly important. They are worthy because they are human. And if you believe the world still needs people who choose mercy when no one is clapping, carry that belief into the next ordinary moment. Because somewhere, in a diner, on a bus, in a hospital hallway, under a leaking roof, someone is waiting to find out whether the room will turn away or whether one person will remember what humanity is supposed to look like. A crystal glass had shattered across the marble.
Everyone stop. Look what she did.
Let me help you with that. It was me, but I can't lose this job.
Victor Langford did not wait for the truth.
Do not stand there like you belong here. Get on your knees, pick up every piece, and remember your place. And remember why people like you belong beneath people like me. People like you should be grateful we let you stand near us.
So he turned one accident into a public punishment.
This is what happens when staff forget they are replaceable.
Eleanor lowered herself beside the glass without begging.
Take her out through the service entrance.
in a way Victor did not understand.
One day, this room will remember exactly what you did.
Then Eleanor lifted the tray of broken glass, looked at Victor, and left through the service door with quiet dignity. And to understand why that moment would one day shake an empire, we have to go back. Nobody noticed the old woman until the glass shattered. For almost 3 hours, she had moved through the golden ballroom like a shadow no one wanted to acknowledge. She wore a simple black uniform, the kind of uniform people looked through rather than looked at. Her silver hair was tied neatly at the back of her neck. Her hands were thin but steady, and her eyes carried the quiet patience of someone who had survived too much to be easily frightened. To the guests, she was just another elderly cleaner working late at a charity gala where one table centerpiece cost more than a month of her wages. To the executives, she was part of the background, useful only because the marble floors needed to shine beneath their expensive shoes. But when the crystal glass slipped from a young waitress's trembling hand and burst across the floor near the center table, every conversation stopped. Heads turned. Cameras lowered. The orchestra softened without being told. And in that brief, sharp silence, Victor Langford saw an opportunity. Victor was the kind of man who had learned to turn even accidents into performances. He was the newly appointed president of Langford Global, a company built on family legacy, public generosity, and private cruelty. On stage, he spoke about compassion. In boardrooms, he destroyed people for sport. That night, surrounded by donors, politicians, journalists, and wealthy families who admired him from a safe distance, Victor needed someone small to blame, someone powerless, someone who could absorb his anger and make him look strong. So he pointed at the old woman. He did not ask what had happened. He did not check whether anyone had been hurt. He simply made sure everyone in the ballroom understood that, in his eyes, the mistake belonged to her. He turned a broken glass into proof of laziness. He turned a frightened waitress into a witness. And he turned an elderly cleaner into a public lesson about what happened to people who forgot their place. At first, the guests only stared. Some looked embarrassed, but embarrassment is often where cowardice hides. A few lowered their eyes. Others pretended to study their drinks. Nobody wanted to defend a cleaner at a gala funded by the most powerful family in the city. Nobody wanted to offend Victor Langford, not while his signature could open doors, close contracts, fund campaigns, and ruin careers. The old woman knelt slowly to gather the glass. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She did not tell them that her name was Eleanor Hayes, or that long before Victor ever wore his first tailored suit. She had walked through the original Langford office when it had only 6 desks, 2 telephones, and a leaking roof. She did not tell them that she remembered Victor's grandfather before the city called him a visionary. She did not tell them that the marble beneath their feet had been purchased with sacrifices the Langford family had spent decades trying to erase. She simply reached for the broken pieces, and that was when Victor stepped closer. To the room, his expression looked like discipline. To Eleanor, it looked like inheritance. She had seen that look before in men who believed money was not only power, but permission to insult, permission to humiliate, permission to rewrite history until the people who built the foundation were buried beneath it. He made certain that his words reached the nearest table, then the next one, then the journalist standing beneath the balcony. He spoke with that cold, polished disappointment powerful people use when they want cruelty to sound like standards. He wanted the guests to believe the old woman had embarrassed the company. He wanted the donors to see him as a man who demanded excellence. He wanted the staff to understand that one mistake could cost them their dignity, and Eleanor kept her head lowered. Not because she was ashamed, but because she was watching the reflection in the glass. In the broken pieces scattered across the marble, she saw the chandelier above her, the guests around her, Victor's polished shoes inches from her hand, and behind him, near the entrance, a young woman who had gone completely still. Lily Langford, Victor's younger sister, stood half hidden beside a column, her face drained of color. She knew something the others did not. She knew that the old cleaner on her knees was not just a cleaner. She knew that her late grandmother had kept a photograph in a locked drawer. A photograph of a younger Eleanor standing beside the original Langford founders, her hand resting on the first company ledger. Lily had found that photograph when she was 17. By then, she had already learned that the Langford family did not tell stories exactly as they happened. They polished them. They trimmed them. They buried the parts that made powerful men look human and powerless. Women look important. Her grandmother had warned her never to ask about Eleanor Hayes in front of Victor. Not because Eleanor had done something wrong, but because the truth had become dangerous inside their family. Now, years later, Lily watched her brother humiliate the one person their family should have honored. Eleanor lifted the last piece of glass from the floor and placed it carefully onto the tray. Her hand trembled only once, so slightly that most people missed it. But Lily saw, and for reasons she could not explain, that tiny tremor hurt more than Victor's words. It was the tremor of someone who had endured too many rooms where silence was safer than truth. Victor was not finished. Men like him rarely were. Public cruelty has a rhythm, and once the room allows the first insult, the second one comes easier. He ordered the event manager to remove Eleanor from the floor before she embarrassed the company again. He said it as if the company belonged entirely to him, as if every name on the walls, every donation plaque, every ribbon-cutting photograph had led inevitably to his authority. He wanted the old woman escorted out through the service entrance, away from the donors, away from the cameras, away from the polished story he was trying to sell. But Eleanor did not move immediately. For the first time that night, she looked up. There was nothing dramatic in her expression. No anger, no plea, no performance. Her eyes simply met Victor's, and for one brief second, his confidence faltered. He did not know why. He could not have explained it. The old woman was smaller than him, poorer than him, older than him, and publicly cornered by him. By every visible measure, he had already won. Yet there was something in her stillness that felt less like defeat and more like memory. Then she lowered her gaze again and allowed the event manager to guide her toward the back corridor. The gala resumed, but not completely. Music returned. Conversations restarted. Silverware touched porcelain. Yet something had shifted in the air. People laughed a little too loudly. The journalists whispered behind their hands. The young waitress cried silently near the kitchen doors. Lily remained beside the column, feeling the old photograph burning in her mind like evidence she had been too afraid to use. Victor returned to the stage 20 minutes later to deliver the speech he had prepared. He spoke about legacy, generosity, responsibility, and the future of Langford Global. He told the room that great companies were built by great families. He praised his grandfather's courage, his father's discipline, and his own vision for a new era. The audience applauded exactly when they were supposed to. But in the service corridor behind the ballroom, Eleanor sat alone on a wooden bench beneath a flickering light, holding a folded envelope that had been hidden inside the lining of her coat for 12 years. She had not come to the gala to cause trouble. In truth, she had almost not come at all. At 74, Eleanor had grown used to living quietly. Her small apartment overlooked an alley behind a bakery. Her mornings began with tea, medication, and the slow ache of joints that remembered too many years of labor. She had no children who visited, no husband waiting in a chair by the window, and no neighbors who knew much beyond her name. To most of the world, she was an old woman with little money and fewer reasons to hope. But that was only the surface. Buried beneath the quiet routines of Eleanor's life was a story the Langford family had stolen, reshaped, and locked away. It began 48 years earlier, before Langford Global was a global anything, before its name hung on hospitals and museums, before executives toasted themselves under chandeliers. Back then, it was a failing logistics company on the edge of bankruptcy, owned by two ambitious brothers who had charms, connections, and almost no idea how to keep the business alive. Eleanor had been 26 when she joined them as an administrative assistant. That was what her title said. In reality, she became the person who understood the accounts, negotiated with suppliers, calmed angry drivers, repaired broken schedules, and stayed long after midnight, building systems no one else had the patience to build. She was not invited into official photographs at first. She was not given credit in meetings. But the company ran because she made it run. Thomas Langford, Victor's grandfather, noticed. Unlike his brother, Thomas still had enough humility in those days to recognize genius when it sat across from him with tired eyes and ink-stained fingers. He began asking Eleanor for advice before every major decision. She warned him which contracts would collapse, which clients were lying, which expansion plans were too risky, and which quiet opportunities could save them. Again and again, she was right. The company survived because of her. Then it grew because of her. And when the Langford brothers nearly lost everything during the fuel crisis that threatened to destroy their delivery network, it was Eleanor who designed the partnership model that became the foundation of their empire. She created the structure that allowed independent drivers to become regional operators. She found the loopholes that kept costs low without breaking the law. She wrote the first expansion plan by hand at a kitchen table, while Thomas Langford paced behind her, terrified and hopeful. For a while, Thomas promised her the world. He promised her a proper title. He promised her equity. He promised her that when Langford became successful, everyone would know what she had done. And unlike many promises made by ambitious men, his was not entirely empty. In 1981, behind closed doors and against his brother's objections, Thomas signed an agreement granting Eleanor 12% ownership in the company if her restructuring plan succeeded over the next 5 years. It succeeded in 3. By then, Langford had become profitable, respected, and hungry. The brothers were no longer desperate men trying to save a failing office. They were rising figures in a city that loved success more than truth. Thomas still meant to honor the agreement, but his brother did not. Neither did the family lawyers. They understood what 12% would mean once the company continued to grow. They understood that the woman they had treated as an assistant would become one of the most powerful owners in the business. And they understood, perhaps most importantly, that Eleanor had no family wealth, no social protection, and no one the city would believe over the Langfords. So they waited for weakness. They found it when Eleanor's younger brother fell ill. Medical bills swallowed her savings. Hospital corridors replaced office nights. Her attention split between the company she had helped build and the only family she had left. During that vulnerable season, documents disappeared. Meeting minutes changed. Her access was reduced in the name of restructuring. People who had once asked for her help began treating her as if she had overstepped. Thomas, under pressure from his brother and terrified of scandal, delayed the announcement he had promised. Delay became silence. Silence became betrayal. When Eleanor confronted them, they offered her a settlement so small it felt like an insult wearing legal language. She refused. A week later, she was accused of leaking confidential information to a competitor. There was no proof that would have held under honest scrutiny. But the Langfords did not need honest scrutiny. They needed enough suspicion to stain her name, enough paperwork to frighten future employers, enough whispers to make her disappear. Thomas never publicly defended her. That was the wound Eleanor carried longest. Not the lost money, not the stolen ownership, not even the years of poverty that followed. It was the memory of Thomas Langford standing in a hallway, unable to meet her eyes, while men in suits erased her from the company she had saved. He sent one letter afterward, just one, written in a hand she knew too well. In it, he admitted that what had happened was wrong. He admitted the ownership agreement was real. He admitted he had been a coward. And he promised that one day he would make it right. But Thomas died before he could. His letter remained with Eleanor, along with a copy of the original agreement and 3 pages from the first expansion ledger. For decades, those papers lived in a tin box beneath her bed. She did not use them because revenge had never been the shape of her soul. At first, she lacked money for a legal battle. Later, she lacked strength. And eventually, she told herself that some truths were too old to matter. Then Victor Langford became president. The first week after his appointment, he announced a redevelopment project that would demolish a block of old worker housing near the original Langford warehouse. The company presented it as progress: luxury apartments, green spaces, a memorial plaza dedicated to the Langford founders. But Eleanor knew that block. She had lived there once. So had drivers, clerks, widows, mechanics, and the families who kept the company alive in its earliest years. The Memorial Plaza would honor men who wore suits while erasing the people who carried boxes through winter rain. That was what brought Eleanor back. She applied for temporary cleaning work at the gala venue under a staffing agency, using the same quiet skills that had helped her survive invisibility for years. She did not intend to confront Victor in public. She intended to find Lily Langford, the one member of the family whose letters to the housing residents had sounded almost human. Eleanor had seen Lily's name on a small foundation notice promising relocation assistance. She had hoped the young woman might listen. She had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that some branch of the Langford tree had grown away from the rot. But before Eleanor could reach Lily, the glass shattered, and Victor showed her exactly how little had changed. In the corridor, the envelope rested in Eleanor's lap. Beyond the wall, applause rose from the ballroom as Victor finished his speech. Eleanor listened to it with a strange calm. There had been a time when applause for a Langford would have made her feel invisible. That night, it sounded different. It sounded fragile. It sounded like glass before the fall. The young waitress approached her first. Her name was Mara, though Eleanor had only learned it earlier that evening when the girl nervously introduced herself near the service table. Mara was 19, maybe 20, with the exhausted bravery of someone working 2 jobs and still apologizing for needing rest. She had been the one holding the glass. Victor knew that. The event manager knew that. Eleanor knew that. But Mara had frozen when Victor blamed the old woman, and fear had swallowed the truth before it could leave her mouth. Now Mara stood in the corridor with red eyes and shaking hands. She wanted to confess. She wanted to say she had dropped the glass, that Eleanor had only tried to help, that Victor had been cruel for no reason. But the apology came out broken, tangled with terror over losing her job, her rent, her scholarship application, the fragile little bridge she was trying to build out of poverty. Eleanor did not scold her. That was one of the reasons cruelty never understood her. It expected humiliation to reproduce itself. It expected the wounded to wound someone weaker. But Eleanor had spent too long being blamed for things she did not do to take satisfaction in blaming a frightened girl for being afraid. She comforted Mara in the only way she knew how, with steadiness rather than speeches. She made the girl understand that one moment of fear did not define a life. But the next choice often did. Mara cried harder then, because kindness can be more painful than anger when guilt is fresh. Before either of them could say more, Lily entered the corridor. She had left the ballroom quietly during the final applause, slipping away from the donors and board members who expected her to smile beside her brother. Lily had spent most of her life inside the polished cage of the Langford name. People assumed privilege made a person free. In Lily's case, it had made her watched. Every choice was measured against reputation. Every friendship was questioned. Every opinion that challenged the family line was treated as youthful weakness. Even after she was grown, she had never been as bold as she wanted to be. That was the truth she hated most about herself. When her grandmother died, Lily found the photograph of Eleanor, the old ledger copy, and a note written in trembling handwriting that warned her the family owed a debt it had never paid. She had tried asking her father about it once. His face hardened so quickly that the question died in the room. After that, Lily learned the family rule. Some doors stayed closed because too much money was stacked against them. But seeing Eleanor on her knees in the ballroom had broken something in her. Not dramatically, not all at once, more like a thread snapping inside a fabric already worn thin. In the corridor, Lily faced the old woman her family had erased, and shame made her look younger than her age. She did not know how to begin. No apology felt large enough. No explanation felt clean. She could not undo the gala. She could not undo the decades. She could not undo the fact that she had known enough to suspect the truth and still remained quiet. Eleanor studied her for a long moment. In Lily's face, she saw traces of Thomas Langford, especially around the eyes. That resemblance once would have hurt. Now it only reminded her that families were not curses unless people chose to obey them. Lily told her, indirectly and painfully, that she knew about the photograph. She knew there had been an agreement. She knew Eleanor's name had been removed from the official history. And she knew Victor's redevelopment project was going to destroy more than buildings. The words came out carefully, not as dialogue but as confession. Each truth carrying the weight of years spent pretending not to understand. Eleanor listened without interrupting. Then she asked Lily, not with bitterness, whether knowing had changed anything. That question settled over the corridor like smoke. Because knowing is easy compared to choosing. Plenty of people know when something is wrong. They know when a colleague is being humiliated, when a worker is being exploited, when a family story has been polished until it becomes a lie. They know, and then they continue living as if knowledge alone makes them innocent. Lily had done that for years. She had known enough to feel guilty, but not enough to risk comfort. Until tonight. Lily looked toward the ballroom doors, where her brother's voice carried faintly through the walls as he accepted congratulations. Then she looked at the envelope in Eleanor's lap. She had no legal training, no power over the board, and no certainty that anyone would believe them. But she did have access. She had archives Victor ignored, passwords he assumed she would never use, and a place on the foundation committee overseeing the redevelopment. More importantly, she had finally reached the point where silence felt more dangerous than truth. Eleanor did not hand over the envelope immediately. Trust, once betrayed, does not return just because the next generation asks politely. Eleanor had learned that documents could disappear, promises could soften, and sympathy could evaporate when money entered the room. She had not carried those papers for 12 years, just to place them into another Langford hand without proof of courage. So she gave Lily something else first. A name. Samuel Reed. At the sound of it, Lily went still. Samuel Reed was not famous. He was not on company plaques. He was not mentioned in official biographies. But deep in Langford Global's oldest accounting files, his name appeared as a junior legal clerk during the year Eleanor was forced out. He had witnessed the signing of the original ownership agreement. He had also notarized a duplicate copy. According to the family story, Samuel had left the city shortly afterward for personal reasons. According to Eleanor, he had been paid to leave. For years, Eleanor believed Samuel was dead. Then, 3 months earlier, a letter arrived at her apartment with no return address. Inside was a photocopy of a storage receipt from an archive facility outside the city and 6 words typed on plain paper. He kept what they buried. No signature, no explanation. Only the receipt, Samuel Reed's initials, and a date that matched the week Eleanor had been accused and dismissed. That was why Eleanor had come to the gala with the envelope. Not because the papers inside were enough by themselves, but because they might lead to something that was, Lily understood at once. The old ownership agreement could be challenged as outdated, disputed, or incomplete. Thomas's apology letter could be dismissed as guilt without legal weight. But if Samuel Reed had preserved original documents, internal memos, or evidence of the false accusation used to remove Eleanor, the story would change. Not only for Eleanor, for the redevelopment project, for the board, for Victor, for the entire mythology of Langford Global. For the first time that night, fear crossed Lily's face for a reason Eleanor respected. Because the truth, if real, would not simply embarrass Victor. It could cost him everything. The corridor door opened before either woman could speak further. The event manager appeared, pale and stiff, with Victor behind him. Victor had noticed Lily's absence. He had noticed whispers among staff. And Victor, like all insecure men dressed as kings, hated conversations he did not control. He looked from Lily to Eleanor to Mara, and the softness he used for donors vanished. There, away from cameras, the polished president became what he truly was, a man furious that someone beneath him still had the nerve to exist after being dismissed. He ordered Mara back to work. He reminded the event manager who paid the venue's contract. Then he turned his attention to Eleanor. He wanted her removed from the building immediately. Not after the shift. Not after paperwork. Immediately. He spoke of trespassing, liability, incompetence, and reputation. Every word was chosen to make cruelty sound administrative. Lily tried to intervene, but Victor cut her down with the ease of long practice. He had spent years training her to doubt herself, to soften her objections, to let him speak first and last. In public, he called it protecting the family. In private, it was domination. That night, however, something had changed. Lily did not retreat as quickly as she once had. Victor saw that change, and his anger sharpened. He warned Eleanor that people like her often mistook proximity to wealth for importance. He wanted the old woman to understand that cleaning a ballroom did not give her the right to stand in one. He wanted Lily to understand that compassion for staff was one thing, but challenging him in front of them was another. Most of all, he wanted to crush whatever invisible thread had formed between them before it became strong enough to pull a secret into the light. Eleanor rose slowly from the bench. Age had taken speed from her, but not presence. She stood with the envelope in one hand and the kind of silence that made Victor talk more than he should. He threatened her with the staffing agency. He threatened her with security. He threatened to make sure no reputable venue hired her again. And with each threat, Lily's face changed, because she was beginning to understand that Victor's cruelty tonight was not an accident. It was his nature. The only difference was that tonight, the victim had a name connected to a buried crime. Eleanor did not reveal the envelope. Not yet. She only told Victor, in a calm, indirect way that chilled him more than anger would have, that men who built their confidence on locked rooms should be careful when old keys still existed. Victor laughed because he had to. In front of the event manager, in front of Lily, in front of the young waitress still trembling by the wall. He needed the sound of laughter to prove he was not afraid, but his eyes had changed. He had heard something in Eleanor's words, not enough to understand, enough to worry, and worry, in a man like Victor, always became punishment. By midnight, Eleanor had been dismissed from the temporary staff list. Mara had been warned that any further discussion of the glass incident would be treated as insubordination. The event manager had been pressured to sign a report, claiming Eleanor acted aggressively after being corrected. Lily was escorted back to the family car under the excuse that the night had been stressful, and Victor returned home convinced he had contained a small problem before it became visible. He was wrong. The next morning, the first video appeared online. It had been recorded by someone at a donor table near the center of the ballroom. The angle was unsteady. The audio was imperfect, but it showed enough. It showed Victor standing over an elderly cleaner. It showed the broken glass. It showed the room's silence. It showed the president of Langford Global speaking to a woman old enough to be his grandmother, as if dignity were something she had not earned. By noon, the clip had spread. By evening, the company's public relations team had written 3 different versions of regret, none of which admitted fault. Victor approved the coldest one. It described the incident as an unfortunate misunderstanding during a busy charity event. It praised the staff. It reaffirmed Langford Global's commitment to respect. It did not mention Eleanor by name. That omission was deliberate. Victor believed unnamed people faded faster, but Lily knew better now. Names were where buried stories began to breathe. That night, while Victor argued with advisors in the main house, and their father avoided involvement with the practiced helplessness of a retired patriarch, Lily entered the private archive beneath the old Langford estate. It was not a dramatic place, just a climate-controlled room with shelves of boxed records, framed awards, obsolete contracts, and family history arranged by people who believed organization was the same as honesty. Lily had been there many times as a child, usually during tours meant to teach her pride. Now she moved through it with a different feeling. Not pride, not even rebellion, something quieter and more dangerous. Responsibility. She searched for Samuel Reed first. The official employment record was thin, too thin. A hire date, a department assignment, a resignation letter, and a forwarding address that led to a building demolished decades earlier. But behind that file, in a box labeled with early legal correspondence, Lily found something strange. A memo referencing duplicate equity instruments assigned for external safekeeping. The memo had been marked irrelevant by a family attorney who died before Lily was born. Duplicate equity instruments. External safekeeping. The words were dry, almost boring, but Lily felt her pulse change. Powerful families often buried their sins under language so dull that no one wanted to keep reading. She kept reading. 2 hours later, she found a ledger index listing restricted storage transfers in 1984. Most entries were coded. One line carried Samuel Reed's initials. Another carried the abbreviation E. Eleanor Hayes. Lily photographed the page with shaking hands. Then the archive door opened. For a moment, she thought it was Victor. Her body reacted before her mind did. Shoulders tightening, breath stopping. But it was not her brother. It was Mrs. Calloway, the estate housekeeper, a woman in her late 60s who had worked for the family since Lily was a child. Mrs. Calloway had the unnerving calm of someone who had spent decades hearing secrets through walls and pretending the silver needed polishing. She looked at the open boxes. She looked at Lily's phone. Then she closed the door behind her. Lily expected a warning. Instead, Mrs. Calloway told her that her grandmother had once asked the same questions. Not openly, never openly, but near the end of her life, when illness loosened the family's grip and regret began slipping through. Lily's grandmother had searched for a woman named Eleanor. She had believed Thomas Langford died with a debt on his conscience. She had believed the company's foundation was not clean. And she had left instructions with Mrs. Calloway in case Lily ever came looking. From a locked cabinet behind old linens, Mrs. Calloway retrieved a small envelope sealed with wax that had cracked from age. Inside was a key, not a metaphorical key, not a symbolic keepsake, but a real brass key attached to a paper tag bearing the name of an archive facility outside the city. The same facility from Eleanor's mysterious receipt. Lily stared at it, feeling the story rearrange itself around her. The past was no longer a rumor, no longer a photograph, no longer a guilt her family could wave away. It had a location. It had a key. It had been waiting. Mrs. Calloway did not ask Lily what she planned to do. Perhaps she already knew. Perhaps old houses teach certain women that justice rarely arrives through official channels. Before leaving, she only warned Lily that Victor had ordered the archive access logs reviewed after the gala. He was frightened, whether he admitted it or not. And frightened men with power did not merely defend themselves. They struck first. By morning, Victor did. Eleanor woke to pounding on her apartment door. The building hallway smelled of damp plaster and old cooking oil. Her kettle had just begun to whistle. She moved slowly, one hand against the wall, already sensing before she opened the door that the world outside had changed. 2 representatives from the staffing agency stood there, joined by a man in a gray coat who introduced himself as a legal consultant for the venue. Their faces held the stiff discomfort of people paid to deliver harm politely. They informed Eleanor that a formal complaint had been filed against her. She had allegedly behaved aggressively toward a company executive after causing disruption at a private event. She had allegedly refused instructions. She had allegedly made threatening remarks. Until the matter was reviewed, she would be removed from all agency assignments. The words fell into the apartment like old dust. Eleanor had heard versions of them before. Allegedly, disruption, threatening, review. Words that powerful people used when they wanted a lie to wear shoes and walk into official records. She did not argue at the doorway. She did not beg them to reconsider. She only asked for a copy of the complaint. The legal consultant hesitated, then provided a printed notice with Victor Langford's name buried beneath formal language. Eleanor accepted it with a politeness that made the young staffing representative look ashamed. After they left, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table and read the notice twice. Then she laughed once, softly and without humor. Victor had made the same mistake his grandfather's brother made decades earlier. He believed that if he accused her first, the world would stop listening. He believed that paperwork could turn cruelty into truth. He believed an old woman living alone would be too tired, too poor, and too afraid to fight. And maybe she had been, once. But age does strange things to fear. It weakens the body. Yes, but sometimes it also strips away the illusion that there is still too much to lose. Eleanor had lost her career, her reputation, her brother, her home, and half a lifetime of recognition. What remained was not weakness. It was clarity. She took the tin box from beneath her bed. Inside were the old papers, wrapped in cloth and handled with the reverence of scars. The agreement, Thomas's letter, the ledger pages, newspaper clippings from Langford's rise, a photograph of Eleanor at 26, standing in front of the original office with sleeves rolled to her elbows and exhaustion hidden behind a smile. She had not looked at that photograph in years. The young woman in it seemed almost like someone she had failed to protect. For a long time, Eleanor had believed justice meant returning to that young woman and giving her back what was stolen. Now she understood justice meant something larger. It meant stopping Victor before he erased another community, another worker, another inconvenient truth beneath the shine of a new memorial plaza. Her phone rang just before noon. It was Lily. Her voice carried the strain of someone who had not slept. But beneath it was resolve. She had found the archive key. She had found references to Samuel Reed. She believed the storage unit still existed. But Victor had begun watching her movements. If she went alone, he would know. If she used a company car, he would know. If she requested records formally, he would bury them before sunset. Eleanor listened, then looked toward the window where rain had begun tracing crooked lines down the glass. For 48 years, Langford men had traveled in private cars while others walked through storms for them. The thought almost made her smile. She agreed to meet Lily near the old bus depot 2 miles from the archive facility. Not at the estate, not at a company office, not anywhere Victor controlled. At the bus depot, a place for people who still understood what it meant to carry their own bags. And by the time Eleanor buttoned her coat, placed the envelope inside, and stepped into the rain, the story Victor thought he had ended in a ballroom was already moving beyond his reach. The archive facility sat at the edge of the city, where warehouses replaced cafes and the sidewalks cracked beneath weeds. It was the kind of place wealthy families used precisely because no one would think to look for their secrets there. Rows of metal doors, fluorescent lights, security cameras with tired angles, a front office that smelled faintly of paper, dust, and burnt coffee. Lily arrived first in an old borrowed car that did not belong to the family. When Eleanor saw her, she noticed the change immediately. The young woman who had stood frozen beside the ballroom column was gone. In her place was someone frightened, but awake. That mattered. Courage was not the absence of fear. Eleanor had learned that long ago. Courage was what remained when fear stopped being the strongest voice in the room. The key worked. That was the first miracle. The storage unit resisted at first, the lock stiff from years of disuse. Then it opened with a metallic sound that seemed too small for the weight of what waited behind it. Inside were file boxes stacked along one wall, a rusted cabinet, and a wooden crate sealed with tape so old it had turned brittle. Dust rose when Lily lifted the first lid. Samuel Reed had kept everything. Not neatly, not completely, but enough. There were copied memos between Langford attorneys discussing how to neutralize Eleanor's ownership claim. There were handwritten notes from meetings where executives debated whether her restructuring plan could be separated from her name. There were early drafts of the false accusation that later destroyed her reputation. There were internal calculations estimating the future value of the 12% stake they refused to honor. And at the bottom of the second box, wrapped in a plastic sleeve, was a notarized duplicate of the original agreement. Eleanor did not touch it at first. She only stared. Some moments do not arrive with thunder. Some arrive quietly. So quietly the heart does not know whether to break or heal. For nearly half a century, Eleanor had carried the truth inside her body like an old injury. She knew what had happened. Thomas knew. The men who betrayed her knew. But knowing without proof had made her memory feel like a locked room no one else could enter. Now the room was open. Lily began crying before Eleanor did. That was the strange thing. The young Langford cried first, not from guilt alone, but from the shock of seeing the family myth collapse in paper form. Wealth had taught her that history was something displayed in frames. These boxes taught her that history was also something hidden in storage units by frightened clerks who could not stop a crime but could refuse to let it vanish. Samuel Reed had left a statement too. It was dated 21 years earlier, written after he learned he was ill. In it, he confessed that he had been pressured to help bury Eleanor's ownership agreement. He described the payments, the threats, the altered records, and the false leak accusation created to justify her dismissal. He admitted his own cowardice without trying to decorate it. And near the end, he wrote that if the documents were ever found, they should be given to Eleanor Hayes first, because no court and no company had the right to hear the truth before the woman who paid for its silence. Eleanor sat on an overturned crate and covered her mouth. For decades, she had imagined proof would make her feel triumphant. Instead, it made her feel tired. Tired for the young woman who had fought alone. Tired for the brother who died while she was buried under legal threats. Tired for every job interview that ended strangely after someone made a call. Tired for the birthdays spent calculating rent. Tired for the years in which the world praised Langford generosity while she clipped coupons beneath a leaking ceiling. But beneath the tiredness, something else stirred. Not revenge. Return. The truth was returning to its owner. Lily photographed every document. Eleanor insisted on taking the originals only after they documented the unit exactly as they found it. That surprised Lily, but it should not have. Eleanor had built systems before Lily was born. She knew evidence needed order. She knew powerful people would attack the process before they addressed the facts. She knew Victor would call the documents forged, stolen, misinterpreted, anything but true. So they worked carefully, methodically, with the strange partnership of two women separated by generations and joined by a debt neither of them had created, but both had inherited. When they finally left the storage unit, the rain had stopped. For a moment, sunlight broke through the clouds and struck the wet pavement. Lily carried one box. Eleanor carried the envelope and Samuel Reed's statement. Neither woman spoke much. Some truths are too large for immediate conversation. Then Eleanor noticed the black car across the street. It was parked near a loading entrance, engine running, windows tinted. Lily noticed it a second later, and the color drained from her face. She knew that car. Not personally, perhaps, but by type. Langford Security used vehicles like that when discretion mattered more than hospitality. Victor had found them, or at least he had found enough. The car did not move as they walked toward Lily's borrowed vehicle. That was worse somehow. It did not need to chase them. It only needed to watch, to record, to remind them that power had eyes. Lily fumbled with the keys. Eleanor kept her pace steady. Inside her coat, the document seemed heavier than paper. By the time they pulled away, Lily was shaking. Eleanor looked out the rear window and saw the black car follow. For several miles, the city passed in fragments. Wet streets, gray buildings, pedestrians with umbrellas, buses sighing at curbs. Lily wanted to panic, and Eleanor could feel it. The girl had grown up around power, but not against it. There is a difference. Being near powerful people can make someone believe power is invincible. Eleanor knew better. Power made mistakes when it got arrogant. It overreached. It assumed fear would do its work forever. She instructed Lily to drive not to a lawyer's office, not to the estate, not to Eleanor's apartment, but to Street, Agnes Community Center. Lily glanced at her, confused. Eleanor explained that decades earlier, when Langford's earliest drivers needed meals during strikes, St. Agnes had fed them. When families in worker housing needed legal clinics, St. Agnes hosted them. When Eleanor herself had nowhere to go after her dismissal, St. Agnes had given her a room for 2 nights and a phone to call her brother's hospital. It was not glamorous. It was not powerful. But it had something Langford offices did not. Witnesses who could not be bought easily because they had already lived without being bought at all. At Street, Agnes, they were met by Reverend Paul Mercer, a broad-shouldered man in his 60s, whose kindness had edges sharpened by years of fighting landlords, budget cuts, and men in suits who called displacement opportunity. Eleanor had known him when he was a young volunteer, with more idealism than patience. Now his hair had gone white, but his eyes were the same. He recognized Eleanor instantly, and for the first time that day, her composure nearly failed. There are people who remember us before the world breaks us. Seeing them again can be a kind of mercy. Inside the community center, beneath fluorescent lights and children's drawings taped to the walls, Eleanor placed the documents on a folding table. Lily explained what they had found. Reverend Mercer listened without interrupting, his expression growing heavier with every page. When he reached Samuel Reed's statement, he removed his glasses and sat back. He knew what the documents meant, not just legally, morally, historically. Langford Global's redevelopment project depended on a story of benevolent legacy. It depended on the idea that the company had always lifted communities, always honored workers, always transformed hardship into opportunity. But if the world learned that the empire had been built by stealing ownership from a working woman, destroying her reputation, and then planning to demolish the housing of the very people who helped build its rise, the Memorial Plaza would become a monument to hypocrisy. Victor could survive a viral video of rudeness. He might not survive proof of inherited theft tied to a current act of displacement. Reverend Mercer made calls. Not many. Only the right ones. A retired judge who volunteered at the legal clinic. A journalist known for refusing corporate favors. A housing attorney already preparing opposition to Langford's project. A former Langford driver whose father had worked under Eleanor's restructuring plan and still kept old payroll records in his basement. Within 2 hours, the folding table at Street Atour, Agnes became something Victor Langford had never feared, because he had never truly understood it. A room full of ordinary people connecting memory to evidence. And while that room formed, Victor made his next mistake. He issued a second statement. This one was not merely cold. It was aggressive. It claimed that the elderly worker from the gala had a history of disruptive behavior. It implied she had approached Langford family members with suspicious intent. It suggested the viral clip lacked context and that the company was reviewing possible legal action against those spreading misinformation. Victor believed he was regaining control by turning Eleanor from victim into threat. But cruelty recorded in public has a way of awakening private memory. After the statement, people began posting their own stories. Former employees wrote about Victor's temper. Contract workers described humiliation hidden behind non-disclosure agreements. Residents from the old housing block shared notices and photographs of buildings Langford planned to erase. A retired nurse wrote that Eleanor Hayes had once paid for medicine for a neighbor's child when no one else helped. An old driver's son posted that his father always said a woman named Eleanor had saved Langford before Langford pretended she never existed. At first, these were only scattered sparks. Then, the journalist from Street, Agnes, published the first article. Not the full story. Not yet. Only enough to widen the crack. The article identified Eleanor by name. It described the gala incident. It connected her to early Langford history through archived photographs and former worker testimony. It raised questions about the redevelopment project and the company's treatment of low-wage staff. It mentioned, carefully, that new documents had surfaced regarding a disputed ownership agreement from the company's formative years. Victor exploded. Inside Langford headquarters, phones rang without rest. Board members demanded briefings. Public relations consultants begged for restraint. Legal counsel warned Victor not to make statements without review. But Victor had never been good at restraint when his pride was bleeding. He wanted Eleanor discredited immediately. He wanted Lily brought home. He wanted the storage unit located and sealed. He wanted every person at Street. Agnes reminded that Langford donations had kept community programs alive for years. And there, finally, the mask slipped in front of the wrong people. During an emergency call with senior executives, Victor raged that the company should have buried Eleanor Hayes properly the first time. He meant legally. He meant reputationally. He meant historically. But one executive on that call, a woman who had survived Victor's leadership by recording meetings for her own protection, saved the audio. By sunrise, she had sent it anonymously to the journalist. The story was no longer about a broken glass. It was about a broken empire. And Eleanor, who had spent half her life being told she was too small to matter, sat in the community center kitchen with a cup of tea cooling between her hands, listening as the world finally began saying her name. By the second morning after the gala, Eleanor Hayes had become the kind of name powerful people feared most. A name they had once erased, now spoken by strangers who wanted to know why. At first, Langford Global tried to treat the scandal like a small public relations fire. They had survived protests before. They had survived lawsuits, whistleblower complaints, and articles written by journalists who eventually moved on to newer disasters. The company's leadership believed outrage had a short life. They believed the public would be angry for a few days, perhaps a week, and then attention would drift towards something louder, fresher, easier to understand. That was how modern shame often worked. It burned hot and then disappeared. But this time, the story did not disappear because the wound beneath it was older than the video. The clip of Victor humiliating Eleanor had given people a face. The documents from Samuel Reed's storage unit gave that face a history. The redevelopment project gave that history a present danger. And suddenly, what had looked like one rich man insulting one poor worker became something larger, something uglier, something the city recognized in its own bones. It became a story about who gets remembered, who gets paid, who gets blamed. and who is expected to vanish quietly so the powerful can stand on polished marble and call it legacy. At Street. Agnes Community Center. The folding table became crowded with paper. The retired judge sorted documents into piles. The housing attorney created a timeline. The journalist worked carefully, refusing to publish faster than the evidence could support, because she understood that Victor's lawyers were waiting for one mistake. Lily sat near the end of the table, pale with exhaustion, answering questions about family archives, board procedures, and the redevelopment committee. Mara arrived after her morning shift with swollen eyes and a written statement about the shattered glass. Still terrified but no longer silent, Reverend Mercer moved from person to person with coffee, phone numbers, and the kind of calm that made fear feel less lonely. Eleanor watched them all from a chair near the window. For decades, the truth had lived in boxes, letters, memories, and the private ache of one woman's life. Now it had become a shared burden. That should have comforted her, and in some ways it did. But it also frightened her more than she expected. When pain is yours alone, you learn its shape. You know where it sits in the body. You know which mornings it will hurt and which names will reopen it. But when pain becomes public, it changes. Other people touch it, interpret it, argue over it, use it. And Eleanor, who had spent years trying not to be noticed, now found herself at the center of a storm that had waited 48 years to break. The journalist wanted to interview her on record. Eleanor refused at first, not because she was hiding, and not because she was ashamed. She refused because she did not want the story reduced to an old woman's suffering. She knew how easily sympathy could become entertainment. People might cry over her lost years, share the video, condemn Victor, and still forget the residents facing eviction from the old worker housing. They might admire her strength while ignoring the system that had required it. Eleanor did not want pity to become a curtain drawn over the deeper theft. So she made one thing clear through Reverend Mercer and the attorney. If her name was going to be spoken, it would be spoken alongside the names of the workers, drivers, widows, and families Langford had stepped over on its way to greatness. The story would not be about one broken glass. It would not even be only about one stolen agreement. It would be about the long habit of powerful people taking from the invisible and then naming themselves generous. That decision changed the direction of everything. The journalist's second article did not begin with the gala. It began with the old warehouse district, with photographs of families who had lived beside Langford's first loading docks, with interviews from retired workers who remembered Eleanor not as a cleaner, not as a roomer, but as the woman who had kept the company alive when the Langford brothers were still learning how to lead. It described how the redevelopment project would remove the last physical traces of that early community while building a memorial plaza that credited only the family. It laid out the newly discovered documents carefully. The ownership agreement, the internal memos, Samuel Reed's statement, and Thomas Langford's apology letter. It did not accuse beyond what it could prove. It did something more dangerous. It asked questions that had obvious answers. By noon, the article was everywhere. By 2, investors began calling. By 4, the city council postponed the redevelopment hearing. By sunset, the board of Langford Global announced an emergency meeting. Victor had expected anger. He had not expected consequence. Inside the executive floor, where glass walls and expensive silence made every crisis feel manageable, Victor stood before his advisors and insisted that the company was under attack. That was always the first refuge of men like him. When evidence appeared, they called it an attack. When witnesses spoke, They called it coordination when the truth threatened power. They called the truth dangerous. He wanted private investigators assigned to Eleanor, to Mara, to Reverend Mercer, to the journalist, and even to Lily, especially to Lily. His sister's betrayal burned worse than the article because it came from inside the family walls. But the company lawyers were no longer as obedient as he expected. They had read enough to understand the risk. If the documents were authentic, the company faced not only reputational damage, but a potential ownership claim tied to decades of unpaid value. Even if legal limitations complicated the matter, the moral and financial exposure was enormous. Worse, the false accusation against Eleanor could open questions about fraud, concealment, and deliberate destruction of records. The lawyers did not say all of that in dramatic terms. Lawyers rarely need drama when fear is already in the room. They simply advised Victor to stop speaking publicly, preserve all records, and avoid contacting witnesses. Victor heard disloyalty in every word. His father, Charles Langford, joined the meeting remotely from the family estate. Charles had spent his life benefiting from the empire his father and uncle left behind, while perfecting the art of distance. He never denied wrongdoing directly. He preferred fog. He preferred phrases about complicated times, unclear memories, and decisions made by previous generations. He had taught Victor that family survival mattered more than family honesty. Yet even Charles sounded unsettled now, because the scandal had reached backward into a past he had spent years refusing to examine. Lily listened from street. Agnes, as the board secretary, forwarded notice of the emergency meeting to all voting members and foundation representatives. Her name remained on one committee list because Victor had not yet removed her formally. That small oversight mattered. It meant she could attend. It meant she could speak. It meant she could place evidence into the official record before Victor had time to bury it under procedure. The retired judge understood the importance immediately. He explained that public outrage could pressure a company, but official records could trap it. If Lily entered the documents into the board proceedings, Victor could no longer claim later that the allegations were merely rumors from outside agitators. The company would have been notified. The directors would have a duty to respond. Silence would become complicity. Delay would become evidence of intent. Lily looked at the documents, then at Eleanor. All her life, she had been told that the Langford name was a responsibility. She was only beginning to understand that responsibility did not mean protecting the name from shame. It meant protecting the truth from the name. The board meeting was scheduled for the next morning. That night, Victor went to the family estate. He did not go to rest. He went to control. The estate sat behind iron gates on a hill above the city, surrounded by old trees and older secrets. From the outside, it looked like permanence made stone. Inside, it was a museum of selective memory. Portraits of Langford men lined the hallways. Awards filled glass cases. Photographs of ribbon cuttings and hospital wings and scholarship ceremonies covered the walls. There were no photographs of Eleanor Hayes. No photographs of the drivers who slept in trucks during the company's first winter. No photographs of the clerks who worked unpaid overtime to save accounts. No photographs of the worker housing now marked for demolition. Victor found Lily in their grandmother's old sitting room. She had returned only to collect the last items her grandmother had left behind, including the photograph of Eleanor at the original office. Mrs. Calloway had warned her that Victor was in the house, but Lily stayed. Running had protected the family's life for too long. Victor entered with the quiet rage of someone trying not to break furniture. He had always known how to make a room smaller. As children, he had done it with mockery. As adults, He did it with money, titles, and threats disguised as concern. He told Lily that she was being manipulated by people who hated success. He told her Eleanor was using her guilt. He told her the documents were probably incomplete, stolen, or misunderstood. He told her that if she helped damage the company, thousands of employees could suffer, families could lose income, and charities could lose funding. It was a clever argument because it borrowed the language of responsibility. But Lily saw the emptiness underneath. Men like Victor often hide behind the innocent people connected to their power. They harm workers, then claim workers will suffer if anyone exposes them. They take from communities, then warn that communities cannot survive without their donations. They build a machine on injustice, then accuse anyone who touches the machine of endangering all the people trapped inside it. For years, that argument might have silenced Lily. Not now, she told him, carefully and without the theatrical courage people imagine in such moments, that the company was already damaged, not by Eleanor, not by Mara, not by the journalist. It was damaged by what had been done and what he was still trying to do. Victor heard only defiance. He stepped closer, lowering his voice, reminding her that the family could cut her off, remove her from committees, challenge her access, and make sure the world saw her as unstable. He wanted fear to return to its old place inside her, and for a moment, it almost did. Lily remembered being 16 and watching Victor destroy a housekeeper's career over a missing watch later found in his own gym bag. She remembered being 23 and seeing him take credit for a foundation program she had built quietly for 2 years. She remembered every family dinner where her objections became jokes, every meeting where he interrupted her until she stopped trying, every warning that kindness made her naive. Fear knew the way back into her body. Then she looked at the photograph in her hand. Young Eleanor stood in front of the old Langford office. Not wealthy, not protected, not famous, but alive with purpose. Behind her, the sign on the building looked crooked. The windows looked dirty. Nothing about the image suggested empire. Yet there was strength in it, a kind of beginning that the portraits in the hallway lacked. Lily realized then that her family had not only stolen Eleanor's ownership, they had stolen the company's better origin. The possibility that Langford could have become great without becoming cruel. Victor reached for the photograph. Lily did not let him take it. That refusal, small as it looked, marked the end of something between them. Victor saw it too. His face changed, not with grief, but with calculation. If Lily could not be controlled as a sister, she would be handled as a liability. Before dawn, a petition circulated among certain board members questioning Lily's fitness to participate in the emergency meeting because of alleged emotional involvement with hostile outside parties. Victor's allies moved quickly, but not quickly enough. Mrs. Calloway had spent too many years serving tea to men who underestimated servants. By breakfast, copies of the petition had reached Lily, Reverend Mercer, and the journalist. By 8, the journalist published a brief update stating that Langford Global appeared to be attempting to silence an internal family member connected to documents under review. By 9, the board chair's office was flooded with calls. By 10, Lily's access was restored. Victor's first trap had failed, so he prepared a second one. The emergency board meeting took place on the 32nd floor of Langford headquarters, in a room designed to make dissent feel expensive. The table was dark walnut. The city stretched behind the windows. Every chair seemed positioned to remind its occupant that power preferred order. Eleanor had never entered that room before. Decades earlier, when her work saved the company, Decisions were made in cramped offices and late-night kitchens. Now the empire she helped build looked down on the city like it had never depended on anyone below. She did not attend as a board member. She attended as a witness, accompanied by the retired judge, the housing attorney, Reverend Mercer, Mara, and Lily. Victor objected before she even sat down. His lawyers objected more politely. They questioned process, relevance, document custody, and security. The board chair, a woman named Adrienne Cole, listened without expression. Adrienne had served on the board for 9 years. Victor had always considered her useful because she rarely spoke unless necessary. That was his mistake. Quiet people are often mistaken for weak people by those who only recognize power when it interrupts. Adrienne had spent the night reading the articles, reviewing internal risk reports, and asking why the company's official history had so many missing pages. By morning, she was not ready to defend Eleanor, but she was ready to hear her. That alone made her dangerous to Victor. The meeting began with legal summaries. Then Victor spoke. He performed concern beautifully. He spoke of protecting employees, preserving shareholder value, respecting due process, and avoiding emotional decisions based on viral outrage. He did not deny that the gala incident looked unfortunate. He regretted how it had been perceived. He respected the dignity of all workers. He welcomed a review. Every sentence was polished enough to sound humane and empty enough to hold no accountability. Eleanor listened. She had heard polished emptiness before. Then Lily presented the documents. Not dramatically, not with accusation in her voice. She simply entered them into the record one by one. The duplicate ownership agreement, the internal memos, the restricted storage index, Samuel Reed's statement, Thomas Langford's letter, the early expansion ledger pages in Eleanor's handwriting, and the archive photographs confirming document custody before anyone at Street. Agnes touched the boxes. The retired judge explained the significance. The housing attorney connected the historical record to the current redevelopment project. Mara gave her statement about the glass incident and Victor's false complaint. Reverend Mercer spoke about the residents facing removal and the community history Langford had ignored. With every document, Victor grew less still. His allies tried to slow the process with questions. They asked whether old documents could be authenticated. They asked whether memories after so many years were reliable. They asked whether a company should be punished for the actions of dead men. These were not unreasonable questions in form, but their timing revealed their purpose. They were not searching for truth. They were building fog. Then Adrienne Cole asked the question that cut through it. She wanted to know why Victor had filed a formal complaint against Eleanor after the gala claiming aggression, when video evidence and witness testimony suggested she had been the one publicly mistreated. For the first time, Victor had no polished answer ready. He reached for procedure, then for confusion, then for the possibility that staff had misunderstood. But the board chair did not let the question dissolve. She asked whether he personally approved the complaint. The room changed. Even Victor's allies became careful. There are moments when loyalty becomes expensive, and people begin counting the cost in silence. Victor admitted, indirectly, that he had authorized a response based on information available at the time. Mara's hands shook in her lap. Eleanor noticed. Without turning the moment into spectacle, she placed her own hand gently over the young woman's. That small gesture did more than comfort Mara. It revealed something to the room. Victor had blamed Eleanor for a girl's mistake. Eleanor had protected the girl who failed to defend her. The moral contrast did not need explanation. Then the anonymous audio was played. The recording from Victor's emergency call filled the boardroom with his own voice. Stripped of polish, in it, he spoke of burying Eleanor properly the first time. He spoke of pressure, containment, and neutralizing sympathy before the situation infected the redevelopment vote. He did not confess to the original theft because he had not committed that one himself. But he confessed to the family instinct that had preserved it. Bury the woman, save the name. The silence afterward was different from the silence in the ballroom. The ballroom silence had been cowardice. This silence was recognition. Victor tried to attack the recording. He questioned its legality, its context, its source, but the damage had already landed. The board members were no longer looking at Eleanor as a possible embarrassment, or at Lily as an emotional relative. They were looking at Victor as a risk, not a leader under pressure. A risk, and in corporate rooms, moral failure can be ignored for years. But risk has a language even cowards understand. Adrienne called for a temporary recess. No one moved at first. Eleanor looked out the window at the city below. Somewhere beyond the towers was the old warehouse district. Somewhere in that district, laundry hung from balconies Victor wanted demolished. Children walked past brick walls marked for luxury branding, and elderly residents opened mail they could barely understand from developers who called displacement transition. Eleanor thought of her younger self racing through account books beneath a leaking roof. She thought of Thomas Langford's promises. She thought of his failure. She thought of the years when her name existed only in rooms that could not protect her. Then she felt something unexpected. Not peace. Not yet. But space. For the first time in nearly half a century, the lie no longer filled the whole room. During the recess, Victor cornered his father in a private side office. Charles Langford looked older than he had the day before. Scandal ages people differently, depending on what they have been hiding. For Charles, the documents did not bring surprise so much as confirmation of what he had avoided knowing. He had inherited whispers. He had seen his father's late-life guilt. He had watched his mother lock drawers and stop conversations when Eleanor's name approached the air. He had chosen comfort over curiosity, and now comfort was collapsing. Victor wanted him to deny everything, to call the documents forgeries, to claim Thomas had been confused before his death, to use the family's remaining influence to force the board into delay. But Charles hesitated. That hesitation enraged Victor more than opposition would have, because Victor had built his life on the assumption that the family would always close ranks around him. Yet Charles, weak as he was, understood something. Victor did not. The old methods had depended on darkness. The documents were now copied, photographed, distributed, and partly published. The witnesses were no longer isolated. The public was watching. The board was nervous. The city council had paused the project. There was no clean burial left. Charles did not become brave. That would be too generous. He simply became afraid of the consequences of continued lying. Sometimes history turns, not because the guilty find conscience, but because fear finally changes sides. When the board reconvened, Charles requested permission to speak. The room tightened. He did not give Eleanor the full confession she deserved. Men like Charles rarely surrender all at once. But he admitted that his father had expressed regret about a woman who had been wronged in the company's early years. He admitted that the family had possessed materials related to Eleanor Hayes. Though he claimed not to have understood their full significance, he admitted that the official company history may have omitted important contributions from non-family figures. Each admission was careful, limited, lawyer-shaped, but each one cracked the wall Victor was trying to hold upright. Victor stared at his father as if betrayal had entered the family through the wrong door. Then Eleanor asked to speak. She had not planned a speech. She had never trusted speeches much. Speeches had been used for decades to praise values the company did not practice. But when Adrienne nodded, Eleanor stood with one hand on the table, not because she wanted drama, but because her knees hurt after a long morning, and she refused to hide that either. She did not tell the room she wanted revenge. She did not ask them to feel sorry for her. She did not describe every year of poverty, every humiliation, every job lost because of whispers planted long ago. She spoke instead about work, the kind of work that does not appear in annual reports, the work of balancing accounts when owners panic, calling drivers' wives when routes run late, finding fuel when tanks are empty, remembering whose child is sick, whose rent is due, whose truck needs repairs before a winter storm. She spoke about how companies love the word legacy because it sounds noble. But legacy is not what a family says after it is won. Legacy is what remains in the lives of the people it used on the way up. No one interrupted. Even Victor understood, perhaps for the first time, that Eleanor's quietness had never been emptiness. It had been restraint. And restraint, once released, did not need volume to be powerful. She ended by making the demand no one expected. She did not begin with money. She demanded that the redevelopment project be suspended immediately. She demanded an independent historical review of Langford's founding, including worker testimony and public archives. She demanded that the old housing block be protected until residents had legal representation, relocation guarantees, and a voice in any future plan. She demanded that the false complaint against Mara and herself be withdrawn in writing. She demanded that the company acknowledge her contributions publicly, not as charity, not as symbolic apology, but as fact. Only after that, she said, would her legal team address the ownership claim. The order mattered. Victor had expected greed because greed was the language he understood. He had prepared to accuse her of wanting money. He had prepared to frame her as an opportunist. But Eleanor placed the community first, the young waitress second, the truth third, and herself last. That did not weaken her claim. It strengthened it in a way Victor could not easily attack. The board chair called for another private session. This time, Victor was asked to leave the room. He refused at first. No one moved to support him. That was the moment he began to understand that power is not the same as loyalty. People had followed him when he looked inevitable. Now he looked costly. The directors avoided his eyes. His father stared down at the table. The lawyers whispered to one another. Adrienne repeated the request. Still calm, still formal, and somehow more humiliating than anger. Victor left, but he did not leave defeated. Men like Victor do not experience consequences as correction. They experience them as insult, and insult, to them, demands retaliation. While the board debated behind closed doors, Victor went to his office, locked the door, and called the one person he believed could still shift the battlefield, Graham Vale, the private consultant who had managed Langford's most delicate problems for 15 years. Graham was not an employee on paper. He appeared nowhere in glossy reports. He specialized in pressure that left no fingerprints, background checks, donor whispers, reputation leaks, strategic lawsuits, anonymous tips, and carefully timed rumors. If Victor was the face of inherited arrogance, Graham was the machinery beneath it. Victor wanted Eleanor destroyed before the evening news cycle. Graham listened, then explained that the old methods were dangerous now. Too many people were watching. Too many documents had already been copied. But Victor insisted. He wanted the public conversation shifted from corporate theft to Eleanor's credibility. He wanted people asking why she had waited so long, whether she had financial motives, whether she had been unstable after her dismissal, whether she had manipulated Lily, whether Agnes was using the scandal to stop development. He wanted doubt seeded everywhere. Graham hesitated only once. Then he agreed. By late afternoon, anonymous accounts began posting fragments of Eleanor's past. Some were distorted truths. Some were outright lies. They mentioned her years of unstable employment after leaving Langford. They suggested she had made accusations against employers before. They questioned why she had no close family speaking on her behalf. One post implied that her brother's medical debts had given her motive to fabricate claims. Another used an old court filing from a rent dispute to paint her as irresponsible. The campaign was ugly because it was designed to be ugly, not convincing enough to prove anything, just poisonous enough to make casual observers pause. For Eleanor, the cruelty landed in a place she thought had scarred over. She had expected Victor to attack the documents. She had expected legal threats. She had not expected strangers to pick through the ruins of her life and turn survival into suspicion. There's a special violence in watching poverty used as evidence against the poor. Every late payment becomes a character flaw. Every illness becomes instability. Every absence of family becomes proof that something must be wrong with you. The world rarely asks what was done to make a person's life difficult. It only asks why the difficulty left marks. At Street, Agnes. Lily found Eleanor alone in the small chapel near the back of the building. The chapel was simple, almost plain, with wooden pews, stained glass faded by time, and a silence very different from the boardrooms. Eleanor sat with her coat folded beside her and Samuel Reed's statement in her hands. She did not cry loudly. She had never been granted that kind of freedom, but her face carried the exhaustion of someone being forced to prove, again and again, that her pain was not a performance. Lily apologized for what Victor was doing. Eleanor did not answer immediately. Then she asked a question that pierced Lily more deeply than anger could have. She wondered how many times her family had used the same method on someone else. How many workers had been dismissed and then described as difficult? How many tenants had resisted and then been painted as ungrateful? How many women had spoken and then been labeled unstable? How many stories had been buried not because they were false, but because the people telling them were too tired to fight the second battle after surviving the first? Lily had no answer. That was the beginning of her real education. Not the documents, not the photograph, not even the gala. The real education was understanding that Victor was not an exception to the family system. He was its most honest product. He had simply said and done openly what earlier generations had hidden behind manners, lawyers, and philanthropy. That evening, the board issued its first decision. Victor Langford was placed on temporary leave, pending independent investigation. The redevelopment project was suspended. The complaint against Eleanor and Mara was withdrawn. Langford Global announced that an external firm would review the newly surfaced historical documents and the company's early equity records. The statement was cautious, corporate, and far from full justice. But it was the first official crack in a lie that had stood for nearly 50 years. Outside headquarters, reporters gathered. At Street, Agnes. Residents cheered. Mara cried in relief when she learned the complaint had been withdrawn. The staffing agency, sensing the wind had shifted, called to offer her assignments again. This time, Mara declined until they confirmed in writing that no retaliation would follow. Eleanor smiled when she heard that. A frightened girl had begun the week unable to admit she dropped a glass. She ended it demanding written protection from an agency that once scared her. That, too, was a kind of justice beginning in miniature. But Victor's leave did not satisfy the public for long, and it did not satisfy Eleanor at all. Temporary leave was a chair moved away from a table. It was not accountability. The company still had not admitted the theft. The ownership claim remained unresolved. The housing block remained vulnerable. Graham Vale's smear campaign was still spreading through corners of the internet, where cruelty enjoyed pretending to be skepticism. And Victor, though removed from official duties, still had money, allies, and the kind of wounded pride that could make a man reckless. He proved it the next night. A fire alarm went off at Street 2. Agnes, shortly after midnight. At first, everyone thought it was a malfunction. The building was old, and old buildings often protested in strange ways. But Reverend Mercer smelled smoke before the alarm finished its second cycle. It came from the administrative office near the back, where copies of the documents had been stored earlier that day before being moved to a secure legal archive. The fire was small, quickly contained, and no one was hurt. But the message was unmistakable. Someone wanted them afraid. Someone wanted them to imagine what might have happened if the originals had still been there. Police arrived. Fire officials inspected the damage. The community center volunteers stood outside in coats and blankets, watching smoke curl from a broken window into the cold night. Eleanor stood among them, her face lit by emergency lights. She did not need anyone to say Victor's name. Whether he had ordered it directly, hinted through Graham, or inspired someone desperate to please him, the fire belonged to the same logic as the false complaint, the smear campaign, and the stolen agreement. Bury the woman, burn the proof, save the name. But this time, the old logic met a new world. Security footage from a nearby grocery store captured a man leaving the alley behind Street. Agnes, minutes before the alarm. The image was blurry, but his car was not. It belonged to a small security contractor used by Graham Vale's firm. By morning, the journalist had the footage. By noon, police had questions. By evening, Graham Vale's name appeared in the press for the first time. Victor's allies began fleeing him, not publicly, not with moral statements. They simply stopped answering calls. One board member canceled dinner. Another leaked that she had always supported a thorough investigation. A donor who had praised Victor 3 days earlier announced concern over governance culture. That is often how powerful men fall, not by sudden conscience around them, but by the rapid disappearance of people who once smiled in their photographs. Victor watched it happen from his penthouse above the river. He had been told to remain quiet. He had been told to let lawyers handle everything. He had been told that any further action could expose him personally. But isolation did not make him reflective. It made him furious. He replayed the gala video again and again, not to understand what he had done, but to identify the exact moment the room turned against him. He blamed the guest who recorded it. He blamed Lily for leaving the ballroom. He blamed Mara for crying. He blamed Eleanor for looking at him as if she remembered something he did not. That look haunted him, not because it made him feel guilty, because it made him feel seen. The next morning, Victor appeared at Street 2. Agnes without warning. He arrived in a dark coat, alone, or at least appearing alone. Reporters were gathered across the street because of the fire, and perhaps that was why he came. He wanted images. He wanted the world to see him approaching the community center, not as a disgraced executive, but as a man willing to face his accusers. In his mind, performance could still rescue him. He believed that if he stood near Eleanor with the proper expression, if he offered regret without admission, if he invoked family pain and misunderstanding, he could soften the story before the investigation hardened it. Eleanor was in the community garden behind the center when he arrived. The garden had been planted by residents years earlier in old wooden boxes, stubborn green life growing between brick walls and chain-link fencing. It was not beautiful in the way wealthy people use the word, but it was loved. Children had painted stones along the path. Someone had tied ribbons to a fence after a neighbor survived surgery. In summer, tomatoes grew beside marigolds. In winter, the soil looked bare, but waiting. Victor should not have come there, not because it was dangerous for him, but because he did not understand places that were loved without being owned. He approached Eleanor with Reverend Mercer, Lily, and the journalist close enough to hear. Cameras watched from the sidewalk beyond the fence. Victor lowered his voice, but not enough to escape recording. He expressed regret for how events had unfolded. He spoke of pain on all sides. He said his family's history was complex, and that he hoped everyone could move forward with dignity. He did not say he was sorry for humiliating her. He did not say the complaint was false. He did not say the documents were real. He did not say the housing project was wrong. He offered fog again. This time, Eleanor did not let it settle. She looked at him for a long moment, the same way she had looked at him in the ballroom. Then she made clear, in that calm way of hers, that dignity was not something people moved forward with while stepping around the truth. Dignity required naming what had been done. It required repair. It required those who caused harm to stop asking the harmed to help them look gracious. Victor's expression tightened. The cameras were still watching, and he knew it. He tried to smile. He tried to turn the moment toward reconciliation. He suggested that Eleanor's legal representatives in the company could meet privately to discuss a resolution. Privately was the word that mattered. Privately was where Langford men had always done their best work. Private rooms had buried the agreement. Private memos had shaped the lie. Private pressure had followed the gala. Private settlements had kept workers quiet. Eleanor understood. She refused to make the truth private again. That refusal spread through the reporters before Victor even left the garden. By afternoon, the phrase was everywhere. Not because Eleanor had crafted it for publicity, but because it carried the force of a life lesson. The truth would not be made private again. For Victor, it was the final humiliation. For Eleanor, it was the first sentence of freedom. But the greatest reveal was still waiting. Hidden not in Samuel Reed's storage unit, not in the family archive, and not in Thomas Langford's apology letter. It was waiting in a place no one had searched, because no one believed an old woman with a small apartment could possess anything more powerful than memory. It was waiting in Eleanor's tin box, beneath the photograph, beneath the agreement, beneath the newspaper clippings, inside an envelope so faded that even she had almost forgotten why she kept it separate. That night, after the reporters left and Street, Agnes grew quiet. Eleanor opened the envelope again for the first time in years. Inside was a cassette tape. On its label, written in Thomas Langford's hand, were 3 words and a date. Not for court, for conscience. Eleanor held it beneath the kitchen light, feeling the past gather around her once more. She had never played the tape for anyone. Not after Thomas died. Not after her brother's funeral. Not during the years when lawyers would have dismissed it as too late, too emotional, too difficult to authenticate. She had kept it because some part of her could not throw away the last sound of the man who had betrayed her and regretted it too late. But now, with Victor still fighting, with the company still measuring justice against liability, with the housing block still waiting under threat. Eleanor understood that the tape was no longer a relic of private grief. It was evidence of a family secret even Lily did not know. And once the world heard Thomas Langford's own voice, the empire would not merely crack. It would have to choose whether to finally tell the truth or collapse beneath the weight of every lie it had ever protected. For a long time, Eleanor simply held the cassette in her hands. It looked too small to carry the weight of a buried life. Its plastic case was scratched, its paper label yellowed at the edges, and the ink had faded into the color of old bruises. Anyone else might have mistaken it for a forgotten piece of junk, the kind of thing found in a drawer after someone dies, kept only because throwing it away feels too final. But Eleanor knew better. She knew the sound trapped inside that cassette. She knew the voice. She knew the hesitation between words, the guilt pressed into every breath, the terrible weakness of a man who had understood the truth only after he had already allowed the lie to grow roots. Thomas Langford had sent it to her 3 months before his death. By then, he was no longer the confident founder whose face appeared in annual reports and museum plaques. Illness had thinned him. Regret had done worse. His handwriting had become uneven, and his letters arrived less like explanations than confessions, too late to become courage. Eleanor had not answered most of them. There are apologies that arrive after the damage is done and ask the wounded person to carry one more burden, the burden of making the guilty feel forgiven. She had not wanted that burden. The cassette had come wrapped in brown paper with no return address, though she knew immediately who had sent it. At the time, she owned no working player. For nearly a year, it remained unopened. Then, on a winter night, when loneliness made the past louder than usual, she borrowed an old tape recorder from a neighbor and listened. She had never listened again, not because the recording was unimportant, but because it was too important. Thomas's voice had carried the truth she had spent years trying to prove, but it had also carried the unbearable sound of a man asking the dead years to forgive him. Eleanor had placed the cassette in the tin box afterward and told herself there was no point. Her brother was gone. Her career was gone. The company had become too large to fight. Thomas was dying. What good could one recorded confession do against a city that had already chosen which version of history it preferred? Now, under the fluorescent light of Street Agnes Community Center, with smoke still faint in the walls from the fire and the city watching Langford Global stumble, Eleanor understood that the tape had waited for a different moment. It had waited until the lie was weak enough to hear it. Lily found her in the kitchen just after midnight. She had been speaking with the housing attorney, preparing for another round of meetings. But worry drew her toward Eleanor when she noticed the old woman had gone quiet. On the table between them lay the cassette, the faded envelope, and Thomas Langford's handwriting. Lily did not touch it. That restraint mattered to Eleanor. A younger version of Lily might have reached for the tape because she was a Langford, and Langfords were trained to believe every object connected to the family belonged to them. But this Lily simply sat across from Eleanor and waited. She was beginning to understand that truth was not found by grabbing. Sometimes it had to be received. Eleanor explained what the tape was, not with drama, but with the tired precision of someone who had spent a lifetime protecting herself from being misquoted. Thomas had recorded it near the end of his life. He had admitted the agreement was real. He had admitted Eleanor's work created the expansion model that made the company rich. He had admitted that the accusation against her had been manufactured by his brother, assisted by lawyers, and tolerated by him. But there was more. That was why Eleanor's voice changed when she reached the part she had never fully allowed herself to think about. The tape did not only confess to the theft, it identified the reason the Langford family had been so desperate to erase her. The 12% ownership agreement was valuable, but it was not the whole secret. Attached to Eleanor's restructuring plan had been another document, a worker participation covenant drafted during the company's most fragile years. It was meant to protect the independent drivers and early employees whose sacrifices made the expansion possible. If the plan succeeded, a portion of the profits from certain original assets, including the warehouse district and the surrounding worker housing, would be placed into a community benefit trust. The trust would fund housing stability, medical support, and education for families tied to Langford's early operations. Eleanor had written the first version herself. Thomas had signed it. His brother had hated it. At the time, the covenant seemed idealistic but manageable. Langford was still small. No one imagined those assets would later become some of the most valuable land in the city. No one imagined the warehouse district would transform from neglected industrial blocks into a prize developer circled like wolves. No one imagined a promise made to workers during desperate years would one day stand between the Langford family and hundreds of millions in redevelopment profit. But that was exactly what had happened. The redevelopment project Victor wanted to complete was not merely cruel. It was built on land that, if the covenant remained valid, the company had no moral right and possibly no legal right to sell without the consent of a trust that should have existed for decades. Lily covered her mouth as the meaning landed. Eleanor looked older in that moment, but not weaker. The years had carried this secret through her body without her knowing its full future shape. She had remembered the covenant. Yes, but over time she had assumed it was just another promise crushed under legal machinery. Thomas's tape suggested otherwise. He had not only signed it, he had recorded where a duplicate had been kept, who had witnessed it, and why his brother's legal team had worked so urgently to remove Eleanor from the company before the 5-year success condition made both her ownership and the worker covenant enforceable. Samuel Reed had preserved the ownership papers, but Thomas had hidden the covenant somewhere else. Not in the company archive, not in the storage unit, not at the estate. He had hidden it inside the cornerstone capsule of the original Langford warehouse, sealed during a publicity ceremony in 1982, before the betrayal was complete and before he fully surrendered to his brother's pressure. At the time, the capsule had been presented as a celebration of the company's future, filled with photographs, letters, and symbolic documents. But according to Thomas's recording, one of those symbolic documents was not symbolic at all. It was the signed covenant, placed there by Thomas himself in a final act of cowardly courage. He had not defended Eleanor publicly, but some part of him had tried to leave a trail for the future. That truth was almost too painful to admire. Thomas had been brave enough to hide evidence, but not brave enough to stop the harm. Eleanor knew the difference. By morning, the tape had been digitized, copied, and secured by the retired judge. An audio expert was contacted. The journalist was told only that another piece of evidence had surfaced, but not yet what it contained. The housing attorney studied the implications with growing intensity. If the covenant could be recovered and authenticated, it would change everything. The redevelopment project would not merely be delayed, it could be frozen indefinitely. The company could be forced to account for decades of unpaid obligations to a trust that should have supported the very families now facing removal. Victor had tried to humiliate a cleaner. He had accidentally awakened the woman who knew where the bones were buried. The problem was that the original warehouse was already fenced off for demolition preparation. Langford contractors had begun internal clearing before the city council postponed the public hearing. Officially, no major demolition was allowed yet. Unofficially, everyone knew how development worked. Walls were weakened. Records disappeared. Old fixtures were removed. Accidents happened. By the time anyone obtained an injunction, the thing worth preserving had often been damaged beyond repair. The cornerstone could not wait. The housing attorney filed an emergency motion. The journalist prepared a story about the possible historical covenant without revealing the exact location. Lily used her remaining access to obtain site schedules and discovered that a contractor had been ordered to perform unscheduled structural work near the warehouse entrance that afternoon. The order had not come through normal channels. It had come from a consultant connected to Graham Vale. Victor was still trying to bury the truth in real time. This time, he did not understand how many people were watching. By noon, residents from the old housing block gathered outside the warehouse fence. Not violently, not chaotically. They came with phones, handmade signs, folding chairs, thermoses of coffee, and the stubborn patience of people who had learned that survival often means showing up before anyone invites you. Former drivers arrived wearing old Langford jackets faded by years of use. Retired clerks brought photographs. Mothers came with children. Elderly tenants came with walkers. Reverend Mercer stood near the gate with Eleanor beside him, while Lily and the attorney argued with site managers who suddenly could not explain why workers had been sent there. The news cameras arrived shortly afterward. Victor arrived last. That was his mistake. Had he stayed away, he might have claimed ignorance. Had he allowed lawyers to speak, he might have preserved distance. But pride dragged him to the warehouse because he could not bear the sight of Eleanor standing before the first building his family had claimed as sacred ground. To him, the warehouse was branding. To her, it was memory. To the residents, it was proof that their lives had not begun as obstacles to luxury apartments. Victor stepped from his car into a crowd that no longer feared his name. He tried to frame the gathering as trespassing and interference with lawful development. He tried to suggest that rumors were being weaponized against a company that had served the city for generations. He tried to present himself as the reasonable man surrounded by emotion. But the cameras had seen too much by then. They had seen the gala video. They had read the documents. They had covered the fire at Street. Agnes. They had heard about Graham Vale. Victor's polished language no longer sounded like leadership. It sounded like habit. Eleanor stood near the fence, her small figure almost swallowed by the crowd around her. Yet when she moved closer, people made space. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The microphone from a local station caught her words clearly enough as she explained that before Langford became an empire, this warehouse had been held together by people whose names never appeared on plaques. She explained that a promise had been made to those people. She explained that the company's own founder had left evidence that the promise had been hidden. And she asked, not for permission, but for preservation. No stone should be moved until the truth inside it had been examined. The phrase spread before the hour ended. No stone should be moved. For a company built on polished foundations, it was devastating. The court order arrived at 3:17 in the afternoon. Temporary injunction. All work stopped. Site secured pending inspection for potentially relevant historical and legal materials. Victor's face changed when the order was read aloud. He looked, for one moment, like a boy denied something he believed birth had promised him. Then the anger returned, but it had nowhere useful to go. Cameras watched. Police stood nearby. Board representatives had arrived. The contractor stepped back. The cornerstone inspection took place the following morning. Eleanor almost did not attend. Part of her wanted to remain at home, to let younger people handle the dust and the microphones and the legal formalities. She had already given so much of herself to the past. But Reverend Mercer reminded her, gently, that some doors should be opened in the presence of the person they were closed against. So Eleanor came, wearing the same black coat she had worn to the gala. Though Lily had offered to buy her something new, Eleanor refused. The coat had carried the envelope. It had carried the insult. It would carry the return. The warehouse entrance was colder than she remembered. The sign above it had been removed years earlier, replaced by temporary development banners now hanging loose in the wind. Workers exposed the cornerstone carefully under the supervision of preservation officials, attorneys, cameras, and witnesses. Every movement was documented, every tool logged, every fragment handled as if the building itself had become testimony. When the capsule emerged, dull and sealed, the crowd outside fell into a silence so complete that the city noise beyond the fence seemed far away. Inside were the expected artifacts: old photographs, a newspaper, a ceremonial letter from Thomas Langford, a company badge, a route map, and a list of early employees. Then the preservation official removed a sealed packet wrapped in waxed cloth. Eleanor knew before it was opened. Some forms of recognition happened beneath thought. Her body remembered the paper, the size, the fold, the old ache of hope. The packet contained the Worker Participation Covenant, signed by Thomas Langford, his brother, Eleanor Hayes, 2 witnesses, and notarized by Samuel Reed. Attached to it was an addendum confirming Eleanor's authorship of the restructuring model and linking the covenant's activation to the same performance milestones described in her ownership agreement. There were also handwritten notes in Thomas's hand, acknowledging that the company's early expansion depended on sacrifices made by workers and that future prosperity should not erase them. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then the housing attorney lowered his head, not in defeat, but in the stunned respect that comes when law and justice, so often separated, suddenly stand near each other. Lily began to cry again. Mara, standing beside a group of residents, gripped the fence with both hands. Reverend Mercer closed his eyes. Former workers embraced one another. Reporters spoke into cameras with voices that shook despite their training. And Eleanor stood still, looking at her own signature from 44 years earlier. The signature was bold. That surprised her. She had remembered being tired when she signed. She had remembered the office smelling of coffee, dust, and rain. She had remembered Thomas smiling with relief. She had remembered believing, foolishly but beautifully, that men who made promises in hard times would honor them in good ones. But she had forgotten the confidence in her own hand. The young Eleanor who signed that document had not felt small. She had known her worth. The world had spent decades teaching her to shrink afterward. Now her own signature taught her back. The legal consequences came fast, not complete, not simple, but fast enough to feel like a dam breaking. The court extended the injunction. The city suspended all redevelopment approvals. Langford Global's board announced that Victor's temporary leave had become immediate termination for cause, pending further investigation into witness intimidation, misuse of company resources, and actions related to the attempted destruction or concealment of evidence. Graham Vale was questioned by authorities, then abandoned by clients who suddenly claimed they had never really understood his methods. The contractor linked to the warehouse order cooperated quickly once he realized he was not being protected. Charles Langford resigned from the family foundation, His statement was as careful as ever. But this time, careful was not enough to save him from shame. He admitted that the family had failed to confront serious wrongs in its history, and that the company's legacy required repair beyond words. It was not the confession Eleanor deserved, but it was the first public admission by a Langford elder that the myth had been false. Victor did not resign from anything willingly. He fought. He threatened lawsuits. He claimed the board had panicked under media pressure. He accused Lily of conspiring with activists. He suggested Eleanor was being manipulated by lawyers who wanted a payday. But every accusation weakened him because every new investigation found more. Messages connected him to Graham's smear campaign. Financial records linked Langford discretionary funds to surveillance of Street. Agnes. The false complaint after the gala had his approval trail attached. The attempted warehouse work had been requested through intermediaries or too close to him to explain away. And then came the poetic justice. No one planned, but everyone understood. Victor had spent his career building the redevelopment project as the monument to his leadership. It was supposed to be his signature achievement. The project that would separate him from his father, modernize the family brand, and place his name permanently in the city's skyline. Instead, the land he tried to clear became the center of the Eleanor Hayes Worker Trust. The very covenant his family buried was revived through a settlement overseen by the court, negotiated under pressure from shareholders, residents, and the public. Langford Global agreed to fund the trust with a historic payment representing decades of unpaid obligations, along with future revenue shares from any development involving the original warehouse district. The old housing block was not demolished. It was transferred into a protected community ownership structure, renovated with trust funds, and guaranteed long-term affordability for residents. The Memorial Plaza was canceled. In its place, the restored warehouse became the Hayes Reed Community Archive and Training Center, named for Eleanor Hayes and Samuel Reed, the woman who built the model and the clerk who preserved the proof when he lacked the courage to do more. Victor's name appeared nowhere on it. That absence wounded him more deeply than any fine. For a man obsessed with legacy, erasure became the punishment he had tried to impose on others. He had wanted Eleanor removed through the service entrance, unnamed in company statements, dismissed from work, discredited online, and buried beneath procedure. Instead, his own leadership was removed from the company history with a precision that felt almost surgical. Future reports referred to his tenure only in relation to governance failure and the Hayes investigation. Business schools studied the scandal not as a triumph of his ambition, but as a case in inherited arrogance, reputational collapse, and the cost of mistaking silence for consent. He was not ruined into poverty. Men like Victor rarely fall that far. But he lost the thing he valued most: unquestioned importance. Invitations stopped. Calls went unanswered. People who once leaned toward him at dinners now found reasons to speak to someone else. His lawsuits dragged, narrowed, and failed to restore what he wanted. The world did not forget him, which might have been mercy. It remembered him exactly as he had revealed himself, standing over an old woman beside a broken glass, unaware that he was the one about to shatter. Mara's life changed too, though not in the loud way cameras prefer. The trust created a scholarship fund for workers in service jobs pursuing education, and Mara became its first recipient. She continued working for a while, not because she had to accept humiliation, but because she no longer carried the same fear into every room. She learned how to ask for written policies. She learned how to document mistreatment. She learned that kindness did not require silence. Years later, when she spoke to new scholarship students, She did not describe herself as brave on the night of the gala. She told them she had been afraid and had failed at first. But someone she failed to defend had still shown her mercy. That mercy became the door through which she found courage. Lily left the Langford estate within a month, not in anger alone, though anger was there. She left because she understood that some houses are built to keep people loyal to ghosts. She resigned from the family foundation after helping transfer its remaining community programs under independent oversight. Then, at Eleanor's urging, she joined the board of the new trust, not as a Langford representative, but as a non-voting advisor for historical accountability. That distinction mattered. Eleanor would not allow another Langford, even a repentant one, to sit above the people whose lives the trust existed to protect. Lily accepted that. It was perhaps the first truly humble thing she had ever done. Her relationship with Eleanor did not become sentimental overnight. Life is rarely that neat. There were wounds between them that apology could not dissolve quickly. Sometimes Lily still spoke too carefully, afraid of saying the wrong thing. Sometimes Eleanor still withdrew when kindness from a Langford felt too close to old promises. But slowly, through shared work rather than grand declarations, something honest grew. Lily visited Street. Agnes. She listened to residents. She helped sort archives without asking to be praised for it. She brought her grandmother's hidden photograph and gave it to Eleanor, who donated it to the community archive only after making a copy for her own apartment. On the day the Hayes Reed Center opened, the city came in numbers no one expected. There were former workers with canes and grandchildren, residents who had nearly lost their homes, students from the scholarship fund, journalists who had followed the story from the beginning, board members trying to look sincere, and ordinary people who had watched the video of the gala and wanted to witness the ending. The restored warehouse doors stood open. Inside, the walls displayed not only the company's corrected history, but the names of drivers, clerks, cleaners, dispatchers, mechanics, and families who had carried the invisible weight of the empire's beginning. Eleanor did not want to speak. Everyone wanted her to. In the end, she agreed only because Reverend Mercer reminded her that some words are not speeches. Some are returns. She stood at the entrance where the cornerstone had once hidden the covenant. The black uniform from the gala was gone, but not forgotten. She wore a simple blue dress Lily had helped her choose, though Eleanor insisted on her old shoes because they were comfortable and because dignity had never required new leather. When the crowd quieted, she looked out at the faces before her and seemed, for a moment, to be looking beyond them too, back to the young woman in the old photograph, back to the night shifts, back to her brother's hospital room, back to Thomas Langford's hallway silence, back to the ballroom where a powerful man had mistaken humility for weakness. She did not tell the crowd that justice fixed everything, because it had not. No settlement could return 48 years. No apology could give her brother more time. No public plaque could erase the nights she went hungry, the jobs she lost, or the years she believed the world had chosen the lie permanently. Eleanor knew better than to pretend justice was magic. Justice did not undo suffering. It gave suffering a witness. It placed truth where denial used to stand. It made the next theft harder. That was enough to make it holy. She spoke of work, memory, and the danger of calling people invisible simply because one has chosen not to see them. She reminded the crowd that the first cruelty in many great injustices is not the final act of theft, but the small permission people give themselves to look away. A room does not become cruel only because one man humiliates someone. It becomes cruel when everyone else decides comfort is more important than courage. The ballroom had taught her that Saint. Agnes had taught her the opposite. One room had watched her kneel alone. Another had stood until the truth could stand with her. Near the back of the crowd, Mara cried openly. Lily held the copied photograph against her chest. Mrs. Calloway stood beneath a window, smiling in the quiet way of women who had carried secrets across decades and finally set them down. After the ceremony, Eleanor walked through the archive alone for a few minutes. She saw the original route maps, the ledger pages, Samuel Reed's statement, Thomas Langford's letter, the covenant, and the photograph of herself at 26. Her younger face looked out from behind the glass with that bold, forgotten confidence. Eleanor stood before it for a long time. For years, she had thought of that young woman with sorrow. Now she felt something else. Gratitude. The young Eleanor had signed her name boldly. She had written the plan. She had believed workers deserved protection before anyone praised such language in public reports. She had trusted the wrong men. Yes, but trust was not the shame. Betrayal was. And finally, after nearly half a century, the shame had traveled back to where it belonged. That evening, after the crowds left and the center lights softened, Eleanor returned to her apartment. It was still small. The alley still smelled like bread in the mornings and rain on old brick in the evenings. Her kettle still whistled too loudly. Her chair by the window still creaked. But the apartment no longer felt like the hiding place of a woman erased. It felt like the home of a woman who had survived long enough to hear the world correct itself. On her kitchen table sat two things. The first was the final settlement letter, confirming her restored ownership value, much of which she had already directed into the trust, the scholarship fund, and legal support for displaced workers across the city. She kept enough to live without fear. That was all she wanted. Enough to pay rent without counting coins. Enough for medicine without choosing between pain and groceries. Enough to buy flowers on her brother's birthday and take a taxi when her knees hurt. The second was the broken stem of a crystal glass. Mara had found it after the gala, tucked near the service corridor, and kept it. Months later, she gave it to Eleanor, not as a reminder of humiliation, but as a reminder of the moment everything began to change. Eleanor had placed it in a small dish by the window. In the morning light, it caught the sun and scattered it across the table in bright fragments. Glass breaks easily. So do lies. Once enough light gets in, Eleanor lived many years after that. Longer than some expected. Not because justice made her young again, but because peace can return strength to places grief has occupied for too long. She spent her mornings at the archive twice a week, helping students understand the difference between official history and honest history. She corrected dates. She identified faces in old photographs. She insisted that cleaners, drivers, and clerks be named properly. When visitors asked whether she hated the Langfords, she did not answer simply. Hatred, she had learned, can become another room. One is trapped inside. She did not want to live in any room built by them. But she also did not offer cheap forgiveness. She believed forgiveness without truth was only another form of silence. She believed mercy without repair protected the wrong person. She believed dignity was not proven by how quietly someone endured humiliation, but by whether they refused to pass that humiliation down to someone weaker. That was why people kept coming to hear her story. Not because it was only about a corporation. Not because it was only about money. Not because it was only about one cruel man at one elegant gala. People came because they recognized the pattern, somewhere in their own lives. They had seen a room go silent when it should have spoken. They had seen someone blamed because they were easier to blame than the truth. They had seen powerful people use politeness as a weapon and paperwork as a shovel. They had seen how quickly the world can mistake a uniform for a person's worth. And Eleanor's story gave them a different ending. It reminded them that the person kneeling on the floor may be the one who built the foundation. The worker carrying trays may be carrying a truth no executive can survive. The old woman everyone ignores may remember the beginning better than the family that claimed it. And the smallest act of public cruelty may open the door to a justice that has been waiting for decades. In the end, Victor Langford was right about one thing, though not in the way he intended. The gala did become a lesson, but it was not a lesson about standards. It was not a lesson about discipline. It was not a lesson about putting people in their place. It became a lesson about what happens when a man who inherited power mistakes silence for weakness, and what happens when the woman he humiliates has carried the truth longer than he has carried his name. So remember this: never measure a person's value by the work they are forced to do, the clothes they are made to wear, or the silence they keep in a room full of cowards. Some people are quiet because they are afraid. Some are quiet because they are tired. And some are quiet because they know the truth does not need to shout forever. It only needs the right moment to be heard. And when that moment comes, even an empire built on marble can tremble beneath the footsteps of one forgotten woman walking back through the door. If you believe dignity should never depend on wealth, status, or power, remember Eleanor Hayes. And if this story moved you, leave a like. Share it with someone who still believes kindness is weakness. And tell us in the comments, would you have stayed silent in that ballroom? Or would you have stood beside her? Years after the gala, people still remembered the sound of the glass, not because the glass itself mattered, and not because broken crystal was unusual in rooms where wealth gathered too closely around fragile things. People remembered it because everything that followed seemed to begin with that sound. A sharp crack against marble, a room turning silent, a powerful man choosing cruelty because he believed no one important would care, an old woman lowering herself to the floor, not knowing that the moment meant to shame her would become the doorway through which the truth walked back into the world. In the archive, the broken stem of that glass was eventually displayed beside a small plaque. Eleanor resisted the idea at first. She thought it felt too dramatic, too close to turning pain into decoration. But Mara persuaded her in the quiet, indirect way people do when they have learned courage from kindness. The plaque did not describe the glass as an object of humiliation. It described it as the moment witnesses were forced to choose between silence and dignity. That wording mattered to Eleanor. It shifted the story away from what Victor had done and toward what everyone else had failed, then learned to do. Visitors often stood longest before that display. They came expecting to see legal documents, old photographs, and the famous covenant that saved the housing block. They came expecting the artifacts of a corporate scandal, yet the broken glass held them because it was ordinary. Anyone could understand it. Anyone could imagine the room. Anyone could feel the terrible smallness of being blamed in public while others watched. It reminded people that injustice rarely begins with something grand. Sometimes it begins with a laugh no one challenges, a false report no one questions, a worker no one names, a lie placed gently into official language until the truth looks rude for interrupting it. Eleanor never liked being called a hero. The word made her uncomfortable, partly because it sounded too clean, and partly because people often use heroes to avoid examining systems. If one extraordinary woman fixes everything, then ordinary people do not have to ask why they stayed silent. Eleanor preferred a harder truth. She had not been fearless. She had been frightened many times. She had delayed many years. She had doubted herself in the dark more often than anyone knew. What saved the story was not perfect bravery. It was memory, evidence, timing, and finally, enough people deciding not to look away at the same time. That was the lesson she gave whenever students visited the archive. She told them that history is not only what powerful people write down. It is also what tired workers remember after their names are removed from the wall. It is what clerks hide in storage units when they cannot stop the crime, but cannot bear to let it vanish. It is what housekeepers preserve in sealed envelopes, what young women find in locked drawers, what communities carry in photographs, songs, recipes, routes, receipts, and stories repeated at kitchen tables long after official plaques have lied. The Hayes Reed Center grew far beyond what anyone expected. At first, it was meant to be an archive and training space. Then it became a legal clinic, then a scholarship office, then a meeting place for tenants from other neighborhoods facing redevelopment, dressed up as progress. Families came with folders of notices they did not understand. Retired workers came with old pay stubs and names of people forgotten by companies that still use their labor in anniversary videos. Students came to research not only Eleanor's case, but the deeper pattern beneath it. How cities praise growth while hiding the people displaced by it. Eleanor watched all of this with a tenderness that surprised her. For most of her life, survival had narrowed her world. Rent, medicine, groceries, memory, grief. These had been the borders of her days. Now her name opened doors for others, not because she had sought fame, but because truth, once restored, can become shelter. The money from her settlement could have allowed her to leave the city, buy a quiet house near the sea, and spend her remaining years far from the place that wounded her. Some people encouraged that. They told her she deserved rest. She did deserve rest. But Eleanor understood that rest did not always mean distance. Sometimes rest means staying in the place where you were erased and no longer feeling the need to disappear. Sometimes healing means hearing children laugh in a building that was almost demolished. Sometimes peace means walking past a plaque with your name on it and knowing it is not there, because powerful people felt generous, but because they were finally forced to stop lying. Victor Langford's life continued, but smaller. That was perhaps the most fitting consequence. He had always wanted scale. Bigger towers, larger deals, louder rooms, more important tables. After the scandal, his world contracted, not to poverty, not to the kind of hardship he had imposed on others, but to irrelevance among the class of people who fear shame more than wrongdoing. He still had money, but money alone could not restore the gaze he once commanded. He still had opinions, but fewer people invited him to share them. He still insisted privately that he had been betrayed by weakness, envy, and public hysteria, but the world had moved on without asking his permission. For a while, he tried to rebuild himself through interviews that never aired, lawsuits that narrowed into paperwork, and private meetings with men who once admired his ruthlessness until ruthlessness became bad branding. The more he tried to explain, the more he revealed that he had learned nothing. He believed he had lost because people had become too sensitive. He never understood that he had lost because, for once, the people he considered background were connected to one another before he could isolate them. His punishment was not only that he fell. It was that he fell in a way that proved Eleanor's lesson. Power without humility depends on silence. Once silence breaks, it has very little else to stand on. Lily's transformation was slower and more honest because it did not end with one brave act. The world liked to describe her as the Langford who chose the truth. But Lily knew that truth had chased her for years before she stopped running. She carried guilt, and Eleanor never pretended guilt was the same as repair. Their relationship remained careful, sometimes warm, sometimes strained, always real. There were days when Lily's presence comforted Eleanor, and days when the Langford name still felt like a shadow at the edge of the room. But Lily kept showing up. She worked without asking to lead. She listened without trying to center her shame. She used her access to help uncover additional records of workers denied pensions, contractors pressured into silence, and foundation grants used to soften opposition to projects that harmed the very people they claimed to serve. Each discovery hurt her, but pain was no longer an excuse to stop. She had finally learned that inherited privilege becomes inherited responsibility the moment a person stops pretending not to know. Mara became one of the strongest voices at the center. The girl who once trembled beside the service corridor learned to stand before rooms full of workers and explain their rights with clear, steady patience. She became a lawyer years later, though Eleanor did not live quite long enough to see her first major case. But she saw enough. She saw Mara study at the archive tables late into the evening. She saw her mentor younger students from families like her own. She saw the fear leave her shoulders little by little. And every time Mara crossed the old warehouse floor with books in her arms, Eleanor remembered the night of the gala and felt something inside the memory soften. Not disappear. Soften. That is often the best healing can do. The old housing block changed, too. Renovation took years, and it was not perfect. Nothing involving courts, contractors, committees, and money ever is. There were delays, arguments, budget concerns, and residents who worried that promises could still turn into traps. Eleanor understood their skepticism. She trusted it more than easy gratitude. Trust built slowly there, brick by brick, lease by lease, repair by repair. Roofs were fixed, elevators replaced, gardens expanded. A child care room opened in the basement of one building. A wall that once carried eviction notices became covered with photographs of the neighborhood's history. The city eventually renamed the street beside the old warehouse Eleanor Hayes Way. She objected to that too, not because she lacked pride, but because she feared one name might overshadow many. The compromise came in the form of a long bronze strip embedded into the sidewalk, carrying not only her name but hundreds of others: drivers, dispatchers, cleaners, mechanics, clerks, cooks, spouses, volunteers, and residents who had built, fed, repaired, challenged, and remembered the community. Visitors walking toward the archive had to pass over those names. Children traced them with their fingers. Families found grandparents there. People cried over names the rest of the city had never known enough to forget. Eleanor liked that. A sidewalk full of names felt more honest than a statue. In her final years, Eleanor's body slowed. Her mind remained sharp, though some days tiredness came like weather. She spent fewer hours at the center, but her presence remained everywhere. In the corrected timeline on the wall, in the scholarship letters, in the legal clinic's insistence that no worker be dismissed as difficult simply for telling the truth, in the training sessions where managers were taught that respect was not a slogan for gala speeches, but a practice measured most clearly when no wealthy guest was watching. On her last visit to the archive, Eleanor asked to be taken to the room where the original covenant was displayed. Lily accompanied her, though she stayed a few steps behind. Mara was there too, now older, more confident, carrying the calm strength of someone who had turned shame into service. Reverend Mercer had passed the year before, and his photograph hung near the entrance, smiling with the same tired kindness he had carried through every fight. Mrs. Calloway's sealed envelope was displayed nearby, proof that even those forced to serve inside powerful houses can choose, quietly and bravely, to preserve what power once destroyed. Eleanor stood before the covenant for a long time. The signature still looked bold. It no longer surprised her. She had come to recognize that the boldness had always been hers, even during the years when the world made her feel small. The betrayal had not erased it. Poverty had not erased it. The uniform had not erased it. Victor's cruelty had not erased it. It had simply waited beneath the surface, like a seed under winter soil, alive in a darkness that could not last forever. Before leaving, Eleanor placed one hand lightly against the glass case. She did not speak aloud, or at least not in a way others could hear. But Lily saw her lips move and understood that the words were not meant for the crowd, or the press, or the company, or even the future. They were meant for the young woman in the photograph, the woman who had signed her name with confidence and paid dearly for trusting the wrong men. Perhaps Eleanor was telling her that they had made it home. Perhaps she was telling her that the truth had arrived late, but it had arrived carrying witnesses. Perhaps she was telling her that the years stolen from them had not been returned, but they had been redeemed into protection for others. Whatever the words were, they belonged to Eleanor, and for once, no one tried to take them. When Eleanor Hayes passed away, the city did not respond with the empty politeness often reserved for respectable old age. It responded as if a witness had left the room and everyone remaining had inherited her responsibility. The archive stayed open late that week. People came with flowers, letters, photographs, and stories. Former residents of the housing block stood beside corporate employees who had joined Langford Global after the reforms. Students read her speeches aloud. Mara placed the broken glass display beneath a small arrangement of white lilies. Lily brought the old photograph from her apartment and stood before it without crying until long after the crowd had gone. Langford Global issued a statement too. This time, it used Eleanor's full name. It acknowledged her as a founding architect of the company's expansion and the author of the Worker Participation Covenant. It admitted that her contributions had been deliberately suppressed and that the company's rise had been stained by actions taken to deny her rightful place in its history. The statement was not perfect. No corporate statement can carry the full weight of a life, but it was public. It was specific. It was permanent, and somewhere beyond the reach of all boardrooms. Perhaps that mattered. Yet Eleanor's real memorial was not the statement. It was the young tenant who kept her apartment because the trust existed. It was the scholarship student who became a nurse. It was the former warehouse worker whose pension claim was reopened. It was the service employee who reported abuse and was believed because policies had changed. It was Mara standing in court years later, defending workers whose names powerful men had never bothered to learn. It was Lily teaching her own children that family pride means nothing if it cannot survive the truth. And it was every person who heard Eleanor's story and remembered a room where they had once stayed silent. That was the final gift of her life. Not that she made everyone brave forever. No story can do that. But she made silence harder. She made cowardice more visible. She made people understand that looking away is never neutral when someone is being humiliated in front of you. She showed that dignity is not granted by wealth, title, age, or applause. Dignity exists before anyone recognizes it. The shame belongs not to the person denied dignity, but to those who deny it and those who watch it happen without protest. Years later, when school groups visited the Hayes Reed Center, guides often ended the tour near the display of the broken glass. They would describe the gala, the accusation, the video, the documents, the fire, the covenant, the fall of Victor Langford, and the saving of the housing block. Then they would pause and ask the students to imagine the ballroom before the truth was known. Not after. Before. Before the articles. Before the evidence. Before the board meeting. Before the world praised Eleanor. Before it was safe to stand beside her. Because that was the only question that mattered. Who would you have been when she was still just an old cleaner on the floor? The answer was not meant to be spoken quickly. It was meant to follow people home. It was meant to sit beside them in offices, restaurants, classrooms, hospitals, hotels, and family gatherings. It was meant to rise in their throats the next time someone powerful mocked someone powerless. It was meant to turn memory into action before justice required decades of repair. Eleanor Hayes never wanted revenge to be her legacy. She wanted the truth to do what truth is supposed to do when it is finally freed. She wanted it to protect, to correct, to warn, to restore names, to make cruelty costly, to make silence uncomfortable, to make the next Victor Langford hesitate before mistaking a uniform for weakness and a quiet woman for an easy target. And perhaps, in the end, that is why her story endured. Not because an empire fell. Empires fall all the time, often under the weight of their own arrogance. Her story endured because one forgotten woman, carrying papers no one wanted to read and memories no one wanted to honor, reminded the world that justice does not always arrive young, loud, or dressed in power. Sometimes justice arrives old. Sometimes it arrives tired. Sometimes it arrives through a service corridor, wearing a plain black coat, holding an envelope close to its heart. Sometimes it kneels to pick up broken glass while everyone else watches. And even then, even in that moment, it is not defeated. It is only waiting. Waiting for one witness. Waiting for one key. Waiting for one document. Waiting for one person brave enough to say that the truth will not be made private again. So let Eleanor's story remain where it belongs. Not locked inside a company archive. Not softened into a polite apology. And not reduced to a scandal that passed through the news and disappeared. Let it remain in every room where dignity is tested. Let it stand beside every worker treated as invisible. Let it trouble every comfortable silence. Let it remind us that the people who build the world are often the first to be pushed out of its photographs. And let it remind us, most of all, that no one is truly powerless when the truth is still alive. A glass may shatter in a second. A lie may survive for decades. But when the right person picks up the pieces, even the sharpest fragments can catch the light. And sometimes, that light is enough to bring an empire to its knees. If this story stayed with you, remember Eleanor Hayes the next time you see someone being treated as if they do not matter. Because in that moment, the choice is not only about them, it is about who you become while everyone else is watching.